Chapter 1. The beginning of something. The hardest part about telling this story is knowing where it begins. Not because the beginning is unclear to me now, it isn't. Looking back, I can identify the exact moment, the exact sensation, the exact shift in the quality of my awareness that marked the start of everything that followed. The hardest part is that the beginning seems, in retrospect, so ordinary, so thin, so easily dismissible. A feeling. That's all it was, at first. A feeling. I've thought a great deal about how to describe it accurately without overclaiming or underclaiming. Without retrofitting the knowledge I have now onto the experience I had then. The feeling, as I experienced it on that first evening, was this. I was being watched. Not followed. Not threatened. Not hunted. Just watched. Observed. The way you might feel the gaze of a security camera as you walk through a shop, or the attention of a stranger across a waiting room who happens to have looked in your direction at the same moment you looked in theirs. A neutral attention. An impersonal regard. But from outside my house. From the street. At night. I should say, before I go any further, that I am not a person who frightens easily. I say this not to position myself as unusually brave, I don't think I am, but because it's relevant context. I grew up in a rural area where the houses were far apart and the nights were genuinely dark, and you learned early that most unexplained sounds and shadows had mundane explanations, and that the habit of constructing elaborate threats from ambiguous stimuli was, in the long run, more exhausting than it was protective. I am, by training and by temperament, a person who looks for the simplest explanation first. I was a journalist for 11 years before I moved to the town where these events took place. I am accustomed to skepticism. I am accustomed to treating my own perceptions as provisional. I tell you this because what follows is an account of 3 weeks during which I progressively failed to find the simplest explanation for what was happening outside my house. And I want you to understand that this failure was not for lack of trying. I tried very hard. My name is not important. The town is not important, or rather, I have chosen not to name it, for reasons that will become clear. What is important is the house. A narrow, two-story Victorian on a quiet residential street, built in the 1890s, purchased by me approximately 14 months before the events I am describing. I had moved there from the city after my marriage ended, wanting space and quiet and the particular kind of anonymity that small towns offer, anonymity not of the urban variety, where no one notices you because everyone is too busy, but of the older kind, where you are known by sight but not by story, a familiar face without an attached history. I had settled in without difficulty. The neighbors were pleasant and unobtrusive. The town had a library I used frequently, 2 coffee shops I alternated between, a hardware store where I had become a regular in the ongoing project of making the Victorian livable, and a park 4 blocks away where I ran most mornings. It was, in the way of small towns that have not been discovered by whoever discovers small towns and turns them into something else, quietly and unpretentiously itself. I was, if not happy, then steadily becoming something adjacent to it. And then, on an evening in October, the 4th Tuesday of the month, around 9:15 p.m., as I was sitting in the front room with a book I wasn't really reading, I looked up at the window that faces the street. And felt, clearly and distinctly, and without any specific reason to feel it, that someone outside was looking in. I set down the book. I looked at the window for a moment. The curtains were drawn. I keep them drawn in the evening, a habit from the city, so there was nothing to see. Just the curtain. The faint orange glow of the street light bleeding through the fabric at the edges. I told myself. A car passed. Headlights. The movement of light through the gap at the curtain's edge registered subconsciously, and my brain, doing what brains do, constructed a watcher from the stimulus. I told myself this, and I picked up my book. And 10 minutes later I looked up again. The feeling was stronger. I have tried to describe it to several people since, and the description that seems to resonate most is this. There is a quality to the air in a room when you are alone in it that is different from the quality of the air in a room when someone else is also present. This is not metaphysical, it may have to do with subtle sound, with the micromovements of air currents, with some low-level sensory processing we don't have conscious access to. But most people recognize the experience. You walk into a room you expect to be empty and know, before you see anyone, that it isn't. The feeling at the window was that feeling. The feeling of someone present. But projected outward, not into the room, but through the glass, through the curtain, into the space outside the house. Someone was there. I was almost certain. I almost didn't go to the window. But I did. I crossed the room, stood at the window for a moment with my hand on the curtain, and then pulled it aside. The street was empty. Orange sodium light on wet pavement. A car parked across the road, a dark sedan, that I recognized as belonging to the family 3 houses down. A recycling bin someone hadn't brought in. The oak tree at the edge of the property casting its late autumn shadow across the footpath. Nothing else. No one. I held the curtain aside for perhaps 30 seconds, looking up and down the street in both directions. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself it was nothing. I let the curtain fall and went to bed. I lay awake for a long time. In the morning, I had mostly forgotten it. By the following evening, I would not be able to forget it at all. Chapter 2. The second evening. The second evening, Wednesday, the day after, I was in the kitchen making dinner when the feeling returned. This time it was stronger and more specific. Not just watched, but watched from a particular direction. I was standing at the counter with my back to the window over the sink, and I felt, with a clarity that I found, honestly, irritating, that the window behind me was being observed from outside. I turned around. The window over the kitchen sink faces the side passage between my house and the neighbor's fence. It is a narrow space, perhaps 4 feet wide, and at night it is very dark, because neither the street light nor my porch light reaches into it. There is a motion sensor light mounted on the neighbor's garage wall that illuminates the passage when activated, but it was not activated. Through the window, in the dark, I could see nothing. I turned the tap on, leaned over the sink, cupped my hands against the glass to block the reflection of the kitchen light, and looked. Nothing. The passage was empty. I held that position for long enough to feel slightly foolish about it, and then I straightened up and finished making dinner. But I ate at the table rather than at the counter, with my back to the wall, facing the kitchen window. I did not acknowledge to myself, at the time, that this was a deliberate choice. What I did acknowledge to myself, as I ate and thought about the previous 2 evenings, was that the feeling had a quality of consistency that was difficult to explain as simple imagination. When I imagined things, a sound misidentified, a shape in peripheral vision that resolved into something ordinary, the experience had a quality of transience. It appeared and then it dissolved when examined. The feeling of being watched had done neither. It had appeared, persisted, survived my attempts to explain it away, and then, when I had gone to the window and found no one there, had not quite dissolved. It had simply waited. That was the word that came to me. Waited. Like a question that had not yet been answered. I also acknowledged that 2 evenings in a row constituted, if not a pattern, then at least the beginning of the conditions required for a pattern. I made a decision. If it happened again, I would go outside. Not impulsively. Not immediately. I would note the time, the direction, the intensity of the feeling, and then I would put on my coat and go out the front door and walk around the perimeter of the house in a calm and deliberate manner and confirm, once and for all, that there was nothing there. This seemed like a reasonable plan. I slept better that night. Chapter 3. Thursday. It happened again on Thursday. At 9:47 p.m., sitting in the front room, I felt it. Same quality as Tuesday, the sense of a presence at the front of the house, near the window, from the direction of the street. I noted the time. I sat with the feeling for approximately 2 minutes, confirming its persistence. Then I put on my coat and my shoes, and I went outside. The night was cold. There had been rain earlier in the day and the pavement was still damp, reflecting the street lights in long orange smears. The air smelled of wet leaves and the faint smoke from someone's fireplace several streets over. I stood on my front step and looked at the street. Empty. Same as Tuesday. The neighbor's car. The recycling bin still not brought in. The oak tree. I walked down the front path to the pavement and stood there for a moment, looking in both directions. Nothing moving. A cat sitting on a wall 3 houses down, watching me with the mild contempt that cats bring to most human activities. 2 lit windows across the street, both curtained. I walked around the left side of the house. Down the passage beside the kitchen, the narrow dark one, feeling along the fence with one hand for balance. Nothing in the passage. I emerged into the back garden. Small, walled on 3 sides, a gate in the back wall that I kept padlocked. The padlock was in place. The gate was closed. Nothing in the garden. I came back around the right side of the house, the other passage, slightly wider, with the meter box on the wall and returned to the front. I stood on the pavement again. Nothing. I looked across the street. The car parked there, the dark sedan. I looked at it for a moment. Slightly fogged windows, which could mean someone had recently been inside it, or could mean the temperature differential had condensed moisture on the glass. I crossed the street and stood beside the car. No one inside. The condensation was on the outside of the glass, consistent with the weather, not with recent occupation. I stood in the middle of the quiet street and turned a slow circle. Nothing. I went back inside. And yet the feeling, when I sat back down in the front room and picked up my book, had not gone. It had, I want to be precise about this, changed in character. Before I went outside, it had the quality of a question. After I went outside and found nothing, it had the quality of something closer to unease. The absence of an explanation was more troubling than a found explanation would have been. I had gone looking and found nothing. This should have been reassuring. It wasn't. I wrote in my notebook, I keep a notebook, a habit from journalism, the following. 3 evenings in a row. Same time, roughly. Same sensation. Same result. Nothing visible outside. No one there. Weather. Cold, damp, unremarkable. No unusual activity on the street. No reason for this feeling. No reason for this feeling to persist after going outside and confirming nothing is there. I underlined the last sentence. Then I wrote below it. Unless the nothing being there is deliberate. I stared at that sentence for a while. Then I crossed it out. Chapter 4. The pattern establishes itself. Over the following 4 days, Friday through Monday, the feeling came every evening. Not always at the same time. Not always at the same intensity. Not always from the same direction. Sometimes it was the front window. Once, on Saturday evening, it was the back of the house, the garden, the back wall, and I went out and checked the padlock and found it intact, the gate closed, the garden empty. Once, on Sunday afternoon while it was still light, I felt it from an upstairs window for the first time, and went to that window and looked out across the rooftops and the street below and saw, again, nothing. The variation in direction was, I found, more disturbing than consistency would have been. A consistent location suggested a specific explanation, a neighbor, a habit, a fixed point. The variation suggested something that moved. Something that chose its position. By Monday evening I had established certain facts. The feeling was real in the sense that it was reliably occurring. It was not triggered by anything I could identify, no sound, no movement, no specific stimulus. Going outside to check produced no confirming evidence. The feeling did not disappear when I went outside. It diminished slightly, as if the act of looking reduced whatever it was, but it did not resolve. I also noted something else on Monday evening, something I had been reluctant to write down because writing it down made it feel more concrete than I wanted it to be. I noted that I had begun to adjust my behavior. Small adjustments. Keeping the curtains drawn earlier. Leaving a light on in the hallway when I went to bed, which I had never done before. Taking a slightly different route on my morning run, a route that passed the front of my house from the street's perspective, so I could see what the house looked like from outside, so I could see if there was anything to see. There wasn't. The house looked like a house. But I had changed my route. That was the thing. I had changed my route. Chapter 5. The first sighting. It happened on Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after the first incident. I was in the upstairs bedroom, standing at the window in the dark. I had begun doing this. Turning off the bedroom light and standing at the window before drawing the curtains, looking out for several minutes. Not exactly hoping to see something. Not exactly not hoping. The window faces the street. From the upper floor, you can see further in both directions than you can from the ground. You can see over parked cars. You can see the full length of the street to the intersection to the left and most of the street to the junction to the right. At 9:53 p.m. on Tuesday, I saw someone. They were standing across the street. On the pavement, between two street lights, in a section of relative shadow. Standing still. Facing the house. I stood very still and looked at them. They were far enough away and the light was poor enough that I could not make out any distinguishing details. I could determine medium height, dark clothing, standing in a way that suggested a person rather than a post or a bin or any other inanimate object, that particular quality of slight ongoing microadjustment that living things have even when they think they are being still. I watched them for 30 seconds, or possibly a minute. It is difficult to be precise about time in those circumstances. They did not move. They were looking at the house. Not at any specific window. At the house. I stepped back from the window, into the shadow of the room, so that if they were looking at the window they would no longer be able to see me. Then I moved to the side, to the edge of the curtain, and looked out from an angle. Still there. Still. Still facing the house. I picked up my phone from the bedside table and opened the camera. Zoomed in as far as it would go. The resolution at that zoom level was poor, grainy, blurred by the distance and the low light, but I took several photographs. When I looked up from the phone, back to the window, the person was gone. I looked at both ends of the street. No one walking away in either direction. No car starting. No movement at all. Gone. I looked at the photographs. 7 images, all blurred, all showing the same stretch of pavement between the two street lights. In the first 2, there was a shape, dark, indistinct, unmistakably human in outline but unidentifiable in any detail. In the remaining 5, the pavement was empty. They had been there for less time than it took me to take 7 photographs. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Chapter 6. Rational Explanations. In the days that followed the first sighting, I worked through the rational explanations methodically and, I believe, honestly. The most obvious. The person was simply a person. A resident of the street or a nearby street, pausing during an evening walk. A smoker who had stepped outside. A person on a phone call who had stopped walking while they talked. A dog walker whose dog had found something interesting in a nearby garden, causing a temporary stop. Any of these would explain a person standing on a pavement at night. What they wouldn't fully explain, or what I found difficult to fully explain with these framings, was the specific stillness. Not the stillness of someone who had paused mid-walk, which has a quality of interruption, of temporary suspension. This was a different quality. The stillness of someone who had arrived at a chosen position and intended to remain in it. The stillness of someone stationed there. I tried to argue myself out of this distinction. Stillness is stillness. I had observed someone standing still for perhaps 60 seconds. There were dozens of innocent explanations for someone standing still on a pavement for 60 seconds. I was pattern matching a threatening scenario onto ambiguous data because I had primed myself with a week of inexplicable feelings to expect something threatening. This was a textbook cognitive error. I knew it was a textbook cognitive error. I tried to treat it as one. But I also noted the disappearance. People who pause on pavements for innocent reasons do not vanish in the time it takes to photograph them 7 times. They resume walking. They turn and go back the way they came. They get into a car. There is a visible transition. The person across the street had not transitioned. They had simply ceased to be visible. one explanation. They had moved very quickly in the time between my looking at the camera and looking back up. Perhaps 10 to 15 seconds. A fast walk or a run could cover significant distance in that time, particularly if they had moved away from the street lights rather than along the lit portion of the pavement. This was possible. I could not rule it out. I also could not, try as I might, make myself fully believe it. I called my former colleague Marcus that week. Marcus had been a crime reporter for most of his career before moving into documentary work and was, as a consequence, one of the most genuinely unsentimental people I knew. I described the situation to him without editorializing, the week of feelings, the first sighting, and asked for his assessment. He was quiet for a moment. "Have you pissed anyone off recently?" he asked. I thought about it. I told him I hadn't, or at least not in any way I was aware of. "Old case you covered? Anyone you wrote about who might have a reason?" I had been a journalist. This was a legitimate question. I thought carefully. Nothing came to mind. My work had never been of the type that made enemies. No criminal investigations, no major exposes, nothing that would give someone a specific grievance. Local government, mostly. Culture. Some features. Nothing that would motivate someone to stand across the street from my house at 9:53 p.m. for the purpose of intimidation. Neighbor dispute. Anything local. Nothing. I thought about this longer. My marriage had ended badly in the way that long marriages that gradually fail tend to end badly: accumulated grievance, slow erosion, a final period of mutual exhaustion. But my ex-wife lived 300 miles away, had remarried, and had, by all indications, no interest in anything about my current life. "Not that I can identify," I said. Another pause. "Then my honest assessment," Marcus said, "is that you saw someone standing on a pavement at night. It happens. People exist outside your house. You've spooked yourself with a week of feeling watched, which, by the way, is a known psychological phenomenon with a name, and you are reading significance into what is probably nothing." "Probably," I said. "Probably," he agreed. "Keep your doors locked. If it keeps happening, call the non-emergency police line and log it. That's it." "Okay," I said. "Don't spiral," he said. "I'm not spiraling," I said. I was, a little. Chapter 7. Week 1 ends. The final days of the first week were a study in the particular misery of sustained low-level unease. There is a difference between acute fear and this other thing, this ongoing, unresolvable state of not knowing. Acute fear has a focus and a duration. It spikes, it metabolizes, it passes. What I was experiencing was something more chronic. A background level of alertness that I could not turn off, that colored every evening, that made the house, which I had, until recently, found genuinely comfortable, feel slightly less than secure. Not dangerous. I want to be careful about that word. The house did not feel dangerous. It felt observed. The feeling came every evening. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Saturday I went out in the evening to dinner with a woman I had recently started seeing. Her name was Lydia, and she would later become central to this story in ways neither of us anticipated, and when I came home at 11 p.m. the feeling was there, waiting for me, as if it had been present throughout the evening and was simply acknowledging my return. That image, the feeling as a patient thing, waiting, is one I kept returning to. I did not see the figure again that week. I stood at the upstairs window on several evenings, lights off, watching the street, and saw nothing. The street was an ordinary street with an ordinary absence of people on it. But on Friday evening, returning from a run, I noticed something I had not noticed before. Across the street from my house, set back slightly from the pavement, there was a mature horse chestnut tree. I had looked at it every day for 14 months without looking at it carefully, which is how it is with things that are unremarkably present. On Friday evening, breathing hard from the run, I stopped on the pavement and looked at the tree and thought, that is an ideal place to stand. The tree's canopy, even in late autumn with its leaves mostly fallen, provided a degree of shadow. Its position was directly opposite the front of my house. A person standing on the far side of the trunk would be partially obscured from the house while having an unobstructed line of sight to the front door, the front windows, the front path. I crossed the street and stood where that person would stand. From there, you could see everything. I looked at the ground around the base of the tree. The grass was short and the recent rain had softened it slightly. There were indentations in the grass. Not dramatic, not clearly defined, not the kind of thing you could point to unambiguously and say, footprints. But the ground had the look of ground that had been stood on more than once in the same place. I stood there for a long time, looking at my house from the outside. Then I went inside. I wrote in my notebook. End of week 1. Established facts. Nightly feeling, confirmed. One sighting, confirmed. Possible standing position identified across street. No explanation. No evidence of threat. But also, no explanation. I underlined no explanation twice. Then I went to bed. Chapter 8. What changes in the second week? The second week was different from the first in one crucial respect. I stopped trying to convince myself that nothing was happening. This sounds like a small change. It wasn't. The effort of sustained skepticism, the constant work of generating innocent explanations, of arguing myself down from a state of alertness that felt instinctively appropriate, of reminding myself of the psychological literature on pattern recognition and hypervigilance, that effort had been, I realized, exhausting. Not because the explanations were unconvincing, but because the act of generating them over and over again, each evening, was its own form of stress. What I replaced it with was not belief in any particular explanation. I replaced it with observation. I decided to document what was happening as precisely and as objectively as I could, without framing it as threatening or non-threatening, without trying to explain it, simply recording it. The way I would have documented a story as a journalist: gather the facts, describe what you observe, and let the facts tell you what they are. This felt, almost immediately, better. Not safer. Not less unsettling. But better, more grounded, more active, less at the mercy of the thing I couldn't explain. I bought a small outdoor security camera and mounted it above the front door, angled to cover the front path and the street beyond. I bought a second one for the back garden. The installation took most of Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon, both cameras were live and recording to an app on my phone. I also began keeping a more formal log. Not the occasional notebook entries I had been making, but a structured daily record with consistent fields. Date, time, nature of the feeling or observation, duration, direction, any accompanying details, result of any action taken. The journalist's habit, formalized. I felt, doing these things, that I was taking the situation seriously without catastrophizing it. Finding the middle ground between dismissal and panic. Being, as Marcus had advised, practical. What I did not anticipate was what the cameras would show. Chapter 9. The camera footage. The first 3 days of camera footage showed nothing unusual. People walking past. A delivery driver. A fox at 2:14 a.m. on Monday, crossing the front path with the practiced indifference of urban foxes. A cat, possibly the same one I'd seen watching me from a wall the first week, sitting on the garden wall for 40 minutes on Tuesday afternoon. On Wednesday evening, the feeling came at 9:08 p.m., earlier than usual. I opened the camera app and looked at the live feed from the front. The street was empty. The tree was there. The pavement was empty. I watched the live feed for several minutes. Nothing moved except a plastic bag drifting briefly across the frame, carried by the wind. The feeling persisted. I went back to reviewing the recorded footage. Not the live feed, the recording from the last hour. I started at 8 p.m. and scrubbed forward. At 8:43 p.m., the camera's motion sensor had triggered a recorded clip. The clip was 40 seconds long. It showed the front path and the portion of the street visible from the camera's angle. At the far edge of the camera's field of view, at the outer limit of what the lens could capture, partly cut off by the frame, there was a figure. Standing still. Not on the pavement directly in front of the house. Further along, where the frame barely reached. Standing in a position that suggested they were aware of the camera's approximate coverage angle and had positioned themselves at its edge. Not hidden, they were visible, but at the very margin of visibility. The figure stood there for the full 40 seconds of the clip, and then, as the clip ended and the recording system resumed its passive state, presumably continued to stand there. There was no subsequent clip, no motion-triggered recording for the next 18 minutes. At 9:01 p.m., a second motion-triggered clip. 3 seconds long. The street empty. They had gone at some point in those 18 minutes. Left no recording of their departure. I watched the 40-second clip 4 times. The figure was the same quality as the one I had seen from the upstairs window the previous week. Indistinct, dark-clothed, human-shaped. Standing with that particular deliberate stillness. And positioned, I noted, at the camera's edge. As if they knew where the camera reached. I called Marcus again. I described the footage. I offered to send it to him. He watched it and called me back. His tone was different from the previous call. Not alarmed, Marcus was constitutionally incapable of alarm, but more careful. More considered. Okay, he said. That's something. Yes, I said. The positioning bothers me, he said. If it were random, they'd be anywhere in the frame. There at the edge. Right. That's either coincidence or awareness of the camera. And the camera was only installed Sunday. A pause. So if their camera were, they've clocked it in 3 days, he said. Or they were camera were in anticipation. They've been here since before the camera. Another pause. Have you called the police? I've been thinking about it. Don't think about it. Do it. Non-emergency line. Log it. Get a reference number. You want there to be a paper trail from before anything escalates, not after. You think it'll escalate? He was quiet for a moment. Marcus, who had covered crimes for years, who had a measured view of human behavior in its darker registers. I think, he said carefully, that what you are describing, the positioning, the duration, the apparent awareness of the camera, the consistency over multiple days, that's not random behavior. Random behavior doesn't have this kind of structure. This is deliberate. Whether it's threatening or not, I can't tell you. But it's deliberate. I called the non-emergency police line that evening. Chapter 10. The police. The call to the police was instructive, though not in the way I had hoped. The officer who took the call was professional and courteous and genuinely tried to be helpful, and the constraints she was working within were not her fault. The situation I described, nightly feelings of being watched, one visual sighting, camera footage of a person standing at the edge of the frame did not, in the formal language of reportable incidents, constitute a clear offense. Standing on a public pavement was not illegal. The footage showed a person doing something entirely legal. Standing outside. She noted the report. She gave me a reference number, as Marcus had advised. She recommended I continue to document everything. She said that if the person approached my house, attempted to enter it, made contact with me directly, or if I felt immediately physically threatened, I should call 999. She said that if the pattern of behavior continued and I accumulated more evidence, I could make a further report and it might be possible to investigate under harassment legislation if the behavior met the relevant criteria. The relevant criteria, she explained, involved a course of conduct, meaning repeated behavior that caused alarm or distress, and that the person knew or ought to have known would cause alarm or distress. I asked whether a person standing outside a house for weeks constituted a course of conduct. She said it could, but that the evidential threshold for formal action was higher than what I currently had. I thanked her and hung up and sat with the slightly hollow feeling that I imagine most people have after that particular kind of call, the knowledge that the machinery designed to help in situations like this is not, at this particular moment, able to engage with the gaze you are offering it. I logged the reference number. I kept the cameras running. I kept the notebook. Chapter 11. Lydia. I had met Lydia 6 weeks before all of this began, at a reading at the town library. She was a landscape architect who had grown up in the area and returned to it after a decade in Bristol. She was thoughtful and direct, and had a quality of paying attention to things, really paying attention, not just waiting for her turn to speak, that I had found immediately striking. We had been on 4 dates. We were, in the tentative early way of people who are both too old to play games but also too cautious to rush, seeing where things might go. I told her about the situation on Thursday of the second week. We were having dinner at her flat, and I had been quieter than usual, and she noticed that quality of attention again and asked. I told her everything from the beginning. The feelings, the sighting, the camera footage, the police call. I watched her face as I talked. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Show me the footage." I showed her. She watched the clip several times without speaking. Then she set the phone down and looked at me. "How are you sleeping?" she asked. Poorly, I admitted. Have you considered that this might be designed to do that? She said. To affect your sleep. To keep you in a state of constant low-level anxiety. That's occurred to me, I said. I'm not sure it changes anything practically. No, she agreed. But it might change how you think about what you are dealing with. This doesn't look like obsession to me. Obsession tends to be less controlled, it tends to want to get closer, to escalate quickly. This is very controlled. Very patient. She paused. That's more troubling, in some ways. In what ways? Obsession makes mistakes. This, she gestured at the phone, this is careful. Whoever this is, they're being very careful. I sat with this for a moment. You're not trying to make me feel better, I said. No, she said. I don't think that's what you need right now. I think you need to be taking this seriously, and I think you are, and I think I can be more useful to you by thinking about it clearly than by reassuring you. This was, I thought, one of the more useful things anyone had said to me in a very long time. Chapter 12. The Note. On Friday morning of the second week, I found a note. Not through the letterbox. Not on the doorstep. On the front path, folded once, placed against the base of the garden wall. As if it had been left there at some point during the night, far enough from the door to not quite trigger the motion sensor on the camera. The note was written on plain white paper. Unlined. The writing was in blue ballpoint pen, in a careful block script, not printed, but not cursive either. Deliberately legible. It said, "You don't need to worry. I am only watching." That was all. I stood on the front path for a long time, holding the note, and thought about several things simultaneously. The first. This was contact. Whatever had been happening, whatever the past 9 days had been, this was a step change. Whoever was outside my house at night was no longer simply present. They were communicating. The second. The content of the note was, in its way, more disturbing than anything that had come before it. You don't need to worry. The structure of this sentence presupposed awareness of my worry. It presupposed that the writer knew I was worried and had decided, presumably as a result of observing me over the past 9 days, that I had reached a level of distress that warranted address. They had been watching closely enough to gauge my emotional state and felt sufficiently confident of their assessment to offer reassurance. The third. I am only watching. Only. The word only. As if watching was the minimum version of something. As if there were other things they could be doing that they were, for now, choosing not to do. Only watching. The fourth. I did not find the note reassuring. I put it in a clear Ziploc bag, evidence handling, journalist instinct, and photographed it in situ before picking it up. I called Marcus. I called the police non-emergency line and added this development to my existing report. The officer I spoke to this time had a slightly different quality of attention. A note had been made, apparently, to follow up my original report, and this new development was treated as a significant escalation. They said they would send someone to take a statement and collect the note. They sent someone that afternoon. The officer who came was in his 40s, unhurried, with the particular kind of reassuring competence that some police officers develop over years of dealing with situations that sit at the boundaries of what the system can formally address. His name was Constable Reeves. He took the note, bagged it properly, took my statement, reviewed the camera footage, and asked me several questions about who might have a motivation to do this. I went through the same list I had gone through with Marcus. Ex-colleagues, anyone I might have upset in my work or personal life. The same answer. No one I could identify. He asked if I had received any other communications, calls, emails, messages through any channel. I hadn't. He asked about the neighborhood. Anyone I had a difficult relationship with, even mildly. Not that I was aware of. He looked at the camera footage again, particularly the positioning of the figure at the edge of the frame. That suggests familiarity with surveillance systems, he said. Not necessarily professional, but informed. Yes, I said. I thought that too. I'll be honest with you, he said. The note changes things. Written communication with the target, that's a qualifying element for a harassment investigation. I can't promise you how quickly this moves, because I won't know until I know, but this is no longer just a watching brief. Someone is making contact. What should I do in the meantime? He went through a list. Keep cameras recording, keep logging, vary my routines, inform someone I trusted to check in with me regularly, consider whether I wanted to stay elsewhere in the short term. I thought about that last one. I'm not going to leave my house, I said. He nodded. Okay. That's your call. Just keep the doors and windows secure and keep your phone charged. He left, and I sat in the front room, and the house felt different than it had that morning. Not less secure, exactly. But more watched. I felt, with a strange and uncomfortable clarity, that the note had not been reassurance. It had been an introduction. Chapter 13. The second week continues. In the days following the note, the nightly feeling continued, unchanged. What changed was me. I found myself, and I am recording this because I think it is important, because I think it is part of what this experience does to a person. I found myself developing new attentions. New habits of perception. The way, when you learn a word you didn't know before, you suddenly begin to hear it everywhere because it was there all along, you simply lacked the category for it. I began to notice things I had not noticed before. The car that was parked on my street on Saturday was not the same car that was there on Sunday. This was not remarkable in itself. People drive cars, cars move. But I noticed it. The particular blue estate car that had been in the same spot for 3 days was gone on Sunday morning, and in the evening a grey hatchback I didn't recognize was in a different spot. And I noticed both things, and neither of them meant anything, and I noticed them anyway. I noticed the people who walked past my house. Not with alarm, most of them were clearly residents, dog walkers, people going to or from the shops. But I noticed them. I had not noticed them before. I had lived on the street for 14 months and been largely invisible to the pedestrian traffic on the pavement, and now I was aware of every passing body. This heightened attention was useful in some ways and costly in others. Useful because observation is, in these circumstances, genuinely important. Costly because it is tiring, deeply tiring, in a way that accumulates over days and begins to affect everything: concentration, appetite, the quality of sleep, the texture of conversations. Lydia, who had begun coming over more frequently and staying later, noticed it. "You are burning yourself out watching," she said, on Saturday evening. And they know it. You think they know it? The note said they were watching. If they're watching as closely as it seems, they know you're depleted. She paused. Whatever this is, it's partly designed to do exactly this. To keep you in a state where your perception and your judgment are both compromised. That's a sophisticated analysis for someone standing outside a house at night, I said. Yes, she said. It is. We looked at each other. You've thought about this before, I said. This kind of thing. She was quiet for a moment. I had an experience, years ago, she said. Different circumstances. But I recognize the mechanics of it. The way prolonged low-level threat works. The way it gets inside your decision-making. She paused again. It's very effective. Because it doesn't need to do anything dramatic. The watching is enough. The watching does the work. What happened? I asked. In your experience? She looked at the window. I left, she said. Which was what they wanted. A pause. I've thought about that ever since. Chapter 14. The second sighting. I saw the figure again on Sunday night of the second week. This time from the ground floor. I had been going to the kitchen for a glass of water, passing through the hallway, when the feeling spiked sharply, stronger than any previous instance, and I stopped in the hallway in the dark and stood very still. The feeling had a directionality. The front of the house. I was directly opposite the front door. The hallway had a narrow window beside the door, a fanlight, low enough to see through from this angle if you crouched slightly. I crouched slightly, and I looked through the fanlight at the front path. The figure was at my gate. Not on the pavement. Not across the street. At my gate. At the low iron gate at the end of the front path, no more than 15 meters from where I was crouching in the dark hallway. Close enough to see more clearly than before. Close enough to confirm. Definitely a person. A man, I thought the build suggested it, though I couldn't be certain. Dark jacket or coat. Standing at the gate, looking at the house. Both hands on the gate's top rail. I had my phone in my hand. I opened the camera. Tried to photograph through the fanlight glass, which was old and slightly wavy and would distort any image. Got 3 shots. When I looked up, they were gone. They had moved in the time it took me to take 3 photographs. Not the 5 to 10 seconds I estimated for the upstairs window incident. Faster. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. They had been at the gate, at my gate, with their hands on it, and then they had not been. I sat on the hallway floor for a moment, back against the wall, and thought very carefully about whether to open the front door. I decided not to. I looked at the 3 photographs. The first showed the gate clearly, with what might have been hands on the rail to dark shapes that were consistent with hands on a rail, though not definitively identifiable as such. The second was almost identical to the first. The third showed the gate empty. I added these to the camera system footage for the evening, which had captured a motion-triggered clip at 10:43 p.m. showing someone at the gate for 11 seconds before the clip ended, by which time the gate was empty, and sent everything to Constable Reeves. He called me the next morning. The gate footage is useful, he said. We can see a person. We can confirm they were on your property, the gate is the boundary. He paused. I want to push this to the next stage. Can you come in and make a formal statement? I went in that afternoon. Chapter 15. What the formal statement did and did not do. The formal statement took 2 hours. It was thorough and it was taken seriously, and it resulted in an enhanced monitoring status, which meant that a patrol car would increase its presence on my street, and it was entered into a formal harassment investigation. This was progress. I want to be clear that I found it genuinely helpful, not as a resolution, but as an indication that the situation was being taken seriously by people who had the tools to do something about it. What it did not do was make the feeling stop. What it did not do was identify who the person was. What it did not do was explain the note, or the camera positioning, or the gate appearance, or any of the things that made this not simply a case of a person standing on a public pavement. I drove home from the police station and sat in my car outside my house for a few minutes before going in. I looked at the tree across the street. I looked at the gate. I looked at the house from the outside, the way the person outside it looked at it. And I thought about something Lydia had said. The watching does the work. Whoever this was, whatever they wanted, whether it was simple intimidation, or something with a more specific goal, or something I hadn't yet imagined they had, over the course of 2 weeks, profoundly altered my experience of my home. The house that I had chosen partly for its quality of refuge, its remove from the things I was moving away from, had become a watched place. A surveilled space. Every room with a street-facing window now had, in some corner of my awareness, an audience. The watching does the work. By the end of the second week, I understood what that meant. Chapter 16. Monday of the third week. The third week began with a change in the pattern. I noticed it on Monday evening. The feeling came earlier. Not at 9 or 10 p.m., as it had been, but at dusk, around 5 in the afternoon, as the October light was failing and the street was still populated with returning commuters and school-run cars and the general activity of early evening. Not in the deep quiet of late night but in the transitional hour, the threshold between day and dark. I stood at the upstairs window and looked at the street in its early evening business, and somewhere in all of that ordinary activity I felt watched. Watched specifically. The particular quality of attention that I had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks, now present in daylight or near daylight rather than in the safe obscurity of night. This was more unsettling than the nighttime version. Not because the daylight was more dangerous, logically, it wasn't, but because it removed the distinction I had constructed, the binary of safe day and watched night. If it was there at dusk, it was in my world, not at the edge of it. It was part of the ordinary hours. I watched the street for 20 minutes and saw nothing unusual. But the feeling stayed until I drew the curtains. On Tuesday of the third week, I found a second note. This one was not on the front path. It was tucked under the windscreen wiper of my car, which was parked on the street. My car, which I could identify. Parked in a spot I had used regularly but not exclusively. The note said, "I have been watching for longer than you know. You are safe." I held it and read it several times and tried to parse it for its full content. I have been watching for longer than you know. This was information I had not been given before. Longer than I know, meaning the 3 weeks I had been aware of it were not the beginning. The watching had begun before the feelings, before the sightings. Before I knew the implication, there had been a period of unknown duration during which I had been watched without feeling it, during which everything had seemed normal, during which I had been going about my life, running, working, having dinner with Lydia, talking to Marcus, visiting the library, all of it while being observed. You are safe. The second time they had offered reassurance. The first note had said I didn't need to worry. This one said I was safe. The repetition of the reassurance, the insistence on it had, I found, the reverse of its intended effect. People who are not threats do not generally feel the need to repeatedly remind you that they are not threats. I photographed the note. I put it in a bag. I called Constable Reeves. He came to collect it in person. Chapter 17. Forensics and their limits. The police sent both notes for forensic examination. The results were limited but not entirely uninformative. The paper was a standard brand available at any high street stationer or supermarket, no distinguishing features. The pen was a common ballpoint type. No fingerprints of value on either note, handled with either gloves or exceptional care. The forensic examiner noted that the edges of the paper were unusually clean, suggesting the notes had been handled with consideration for fingerprint avoidance. The handwriting was distinctive enough to be identifiable if a comparison sample could be obtained, but without a suspect, the distinctiveness was of limited use. What the forensics confirmed. Someone careful. Someone who had thought about evidence. Someone who, when they decided to make written contact, had done so in a way designed to minimize the material trace they left. Constable Reeves shared this with me during a call on Wednesday. This is organized, he said. The forensic awareness, the camera positioning, the note content, this isn't impulsive behavior. This is someone who has planned. Planned for how long? I can't answer that. But given what the second note says, about watching for longer than you know, we have to consider that this may have started significantly before you were aware of it. How does that affect the investigation? It broadens the scope, he said carefully. We've been looking at people who might have a recent motivation. If this started earlier, we need to look at a longer timeline. Is there anything from further back, 6 months, a year, more that might be relevant? I thought hard. I went through my life in the town. The people I had met, the interactions I had had, anything that might have generated this level of sustained, careful, patient attention. I thought about my work. I had been freelancing since leaving journalism full-time, pieces for national publications, mostly on topics of general interest rather than investigation. Nothing, I thought, that would generate this kind of response. I thought about the house. Its history, the previous owners, anyone who might have a connection to the property. I thought about the town itself. Whether I had become, in some way I wasn't aware of, a focus for something that had preceded my arrival. None of these lines of thought produced anything concrete. I can't identify anything, I told Reeves. All right, he said. Keep thinking. Chapter 18. What Lydia told me. On Wednesday evening, Lydia told me something that reframed everything. We were sitting in my kitchen, late, talking about the investigation. I had shared the forensic results. She was listening in that attentive way of hers, turning a cup of tea in her hands. Then she said, "Can I tell you something that might be relevant? Something I should have told you before, and didn't, because I wasn't sure it was connected. I said yes. She said, before I came back here, before I moved back to the town, about 8 months ago, there was someone who followed me. In Bristol. For about 4 months. I waited. They never made contact. Never threatened me. Just watched. I would see the same person in different places, outside my flat, near my work, at places I went regularly. I reported it to the police there. They were attentive but couldn't do very much. And then, after about 4 months, it stopped. She looked at her cup. I thought it had just ended. Whoever it was had moved on. I never found out who they were or why they had chosen me. She paused. When I came back here, I felt safer. Partly that's why I came back, the sense that I was coming home, to a place where things like that didn't happen to me. She looked up. The description you've given me, of the way this person behaves, the patience, the positioning, the notes that offer reassurance, the forensic awareness, it sounds the same. The same quality. I looked at her. You think it's the same person? I don't know, she said. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know why they would transfer from following me to following you. I don't even know if it's related. But the structural similarity is, she stopped. It troubled me. When you first described it. It troubled me and I didn't say anything, and I should have. I thought about this carefully. You said it stopped in Bristol, I said. What do you mean by stopped? I mean I stopped seeing them. Stopped feeling watched. The ordinary business of life resumed. She paused. But I don't know that they stopped. I only know that I stopped noticing. The distinction. I think about that distinction often, now. Chapter 19. The connection. I told Constable Reeves about Lydia's experience the next morning. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Did she make a formal report in Bristol? He asked. Yes. She has the reference number. I'll need to speak with her directly. And get the Bristol reference. There may be information in that case that would be relevant. She's willing. Good. A pause. I want to be careful about how I say this, but if there is a connection between these two cases, it changes what we're looking at. It suggests someone who is mobile, patient over very long periods, and capable of transferring their focus from one person to another. That's a specific profile. Do you know what that profile means? He was quiet for a long moment. It means we should take this very seriously, he said. We already were. But this. He didn't finish the sentence. This is what? I asked. More organized than the typical case, he said. Than what we usually see. He asked me to come in that afternoon with Lydia. We did. She gave her statement. Reeves made contact with the Bristol police. The connection could not be confirmed quickly, records, coordination, bureaucracy, but Reeves told us, at the end of the afternoon, that he was not skeptical of Lydia's account, and that the similarities were, in his professional assessment, notable. We drove home in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full. Lydia stayed that night and the night after. Chapter 20. The third week continues. The third week had a quality of heightened reality, a sharpness and definition that prolonged stress produces, which is double-edged, because the sharpness that makes you perceive things clearly also makes what you perceive land harder. The feelings continued every evening. The cameras continued to record. I had, by now, accumulated hours of footage and a comprehensive log of every incident. Constable Reeves was, by his standards, in regular contact. The investigation was active. But nothing resolved. No identification of the watcher. No apprehension. No clarity. What happened instead was a progressive deepening of the strange quality of life under observation, a life in which the ordinary fabric of daily activity was unchanged on the surface while being, underneath, rewoven around an awareness that could not be suspended. I want to try to describe this accurately, because I think it is important. The experience of being watched, sustained over weeks, does something specific to the architecture of your interior life. It creates a duplication of perspective. You begin to see yourself from outside yourself, not constantly, not deliberately, but as a background process, a running parallel viewpoint. You walk to the kitchen and a part of your awareness notes. Someone might be watching you walk to the kitchen. You sit at your desk and part of your awareness notes. If someone is watching the window, they can see you sitting at your desk. You move through your own house and there is a narrator tracking. This is exhausting in a very specific way. The exhaustion is not physical, though it manifests physically. It is the exhaustion of permanent self-consciousness. Of never being quite alone inside your own life. Lydia recognized it. She had felt it before. It's designed to do this, she said, on Friday evening of the third week. Whatever else is motivating this person, the watching itself is the instrument. It doesn't need to escalate. The watching is sufficient. Sufficient for what? I asked. She thought for a moment. For changing you, she said. For changing how you occupy the world. For making you smaller. I thought about this. I'm not going to get smaller, I said. She looked at me with something that was not quite a smile. I know, she said. That's not what I'm worried about. What are you worried about? That whoever this is knows that too, she said. That they've been watching long enough to know exactly what kind of person you are. And have planned accordingly. Chapter 21. The third note. On Saturday of the third week, the 20th day since the first evening, there was a third note. This one was different. It was not on the front path. Not on the car. It was in the letterbox, pushed through the slot, folded twice, landing on the mat inside the front door. To push a note through a letterbox, you have to stand at the front door. You have to be at the threshold. The camera should have captured this. I checked the footage immediately. There was a motion-triggered clip from 3:47 a.m. It showed nothing. The front step, the gate, the street beyond. No one there. The clip was 12 seconds long. No one visible in any frame. But the note was on the mat. I checked the camera settings. No malfunction. The SD card showed continuous recording, no gap. The footage was intact. There was simply no person in it. I held the note and read it. It said, I know you have been looking for me. I wanted you to know that I can see you looking. This is not a threat. This is an explanation. Some watchers are watched. You were being watched before me. I am watching the watchers. You are safe from what I am watching. You have always been safe from it. But it has not always been watching you. I read it 4 times. Then I sat down on the hallway floor, with my back against the wall, and the note in my hand, and I stayed there for a very long time. Chapter 22. What the third note changed. The third note changed everything, and nothing. Everything. The frame. The explanation. The reason for the watching, offered now, after 3 weeks of silence and 2 notes of bare reassurance, in something approaching plain language. Someone watching the watchers. A protective observation rather than a predatory one. A watcher positioned outside my house not to study me but to guard me, or to study whatever was studying me. Nothing. The fear. Because fear is not purely rational, and the suggestion that you have been watched by something other than the figure in dark clothes at your gate not for 3 weeks but for some longer and unspecified period, not watched by someone with a human motivation however strange but watched by something whose nature the note did not define, whose presence in your life you had been unaware of, whose attention the unknown guardian had appointed themselves to monitor. Fear is not purely rational. I photographed the note. I called Reeves immediately, even though it was a Saturday morning at 3:45. He answered on the 3rd ring. I read him the note. There was a long silence. Then he said, "I'm coming over." He arrived within 30 minutes, which told me something about how he had assessed the situation. He read the note several times, as I had. He reviewed the footage, the empty clip from 3:47 a.m., the empty step, the note that had no visible deliverer. The camera didn't malfunction? He asked. No. He looked at the footage again. There's a gap, he said. What? He played the clip again, slowly. Here, frame 847. And here, frame 849. The timestamp runs continuously, but the content look at the shadow from the gatepost. It jumps. Between frame 847 and frame 849, the shadow has moved. Not much. But it has moved. I looked. He was right. It was subtle enough that I had missed it a fraction of a degree in the shadow's angle, consistent with approximately 4 to 5 seconds of real time. The clip has been edited, he said. By who? He looked at me. Someone with access to your camera system or the footage files. I thought about this. The system is cloud-based. Password protected. I'm the only person who has the login. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said. I want to get a digital forensics person to look at your camera system. Today if possible. A pause. And I want you to think about whether there's anywhere you can stay for the next few days. Both of you. Because of the camera access. I said. If they can access the camera remotely, it suggests a level of capability that I wasn't previously factoring in, he said carefully. That's all. Chapter 23. What came before? In the days that followed, the final days of the 3rd week and the immediate aftermath, I began to understand, in fragments and through the patient work of multiple people, something about what the 3rd note had been pointing at. I cannot tell all of this story. Some of it involves people who have asked not to be identified. Some of it involves ongoing matters that are not mine to detail publicly. What I can tell is the shape of it, the outline. The town, the quiet town I had chosen for its unremarkability, its remove from the things that had made me want to move, had a history that was not, it turned out, entirely unremarkable. Over a period of approximately 7 years, 4 people who lived in or around the town had reported similar experiences to mine. Not identical, the specifics varied, but structurally similar. The sense of being watched. The inability to identify a source. A gradual escalation of unease, followed, in each case, by some form of contact or communication, followed, in each case, by a resolution of one kind or another. 2 of the 4 had left the town. They were, as far as could be determined, fine. 1 of the 4 had remained and eventually identified the source of the watching as a neighbor with a specific grievance that had never been communicated directly. This case, in retrospect, was different in character from the others, more personal, more contained, and may not have belonged in the pattern. The 4th person's case had not resolved in the conventional sense. What had happened instead was that the watching had stopped abruptly, mid-pattern, in a way that the person had described as more unsettling than its continuation would have been. As if something had been interrupted. As if a circuit had been broken from outside. This 4th person, I learned, had received a note during their experience. A note that read, "You are safe from what I am watching." Not identically to mine. But the phrase. The same phrase. The person who wrote the notes to these 4 people over 7 years, the watcher of watchers, was never identified. The police had no usable evidence. The descriptions of the figure across the street, at the gate, in the shadows, were all consistent and all too vague to be actionable. The forensic results from the notes in the other cases were the same as mine. Careful, evidentially minimal, deliberately so. What could be established across all 4 cases was this. In each case, after the intervention of the notewriter, the watcher, the original subject of surveillance, reported that the feeling of being watched from outside ceased. Not gradually. Suddenly. As if the thing that had been attending to them had been disrupted or redirected. In each case, there was no further explanation. In each case, the life of the person resumed. Chapter 24. The shape of what remains. I want to be careful, here at the end of the 3rd week's account, not to construct a neat resolution where none was given. The watching of my house stopped on the 21st night, a Tuesday, 3 weeks exactly from the Tuesday it had begun. I did not see the figure again after the gate appearance. The feelings did not come on Tuesday evening. I stood at the upstairs window in the dark, as I had done each night, and looked at the tree and the pavement and the gate and felt nothing. The ordinary absence of sensation that used to be the default had returned. I did not know why. I do not know now why. The investigation continued. No one was identified, charged, or cautioned in connection with the harassment. The notes remained in evidence. The camera footage, including the edited clip, was analyzed and the nature of the editing was confirmed but not attributed. The Bristol case connection was neither confirmed nor denied. What the police could tell me, at the end of their formal engagement with the case, was this. In their assessment, the activity had ceased. There was no ongoing threat they could identify. I should remain alert and contact them immediately if anything resumed. I thanked them. I said I would. What I could not stop thinking about was the content of the third note. The part that was harder to hold than the part about the watcher of watchers. You were being watched before me. Before the figure in dark clothes at the gate. Before the 3 weeks I was aware of. Before, presumably, the figure began whatever their watching was. Something else. Something that the unknown guardian had been monitoring. Something whose attention, the note said, had not always been on me, implying that at some point it had become so, and that this transition was the event the guardian had responded to. I am watching the watchers. Plural. Watchers. Not one thing. More than one. You are safe from what I am watching. From what? Not from whom. From what? I had been comforted, at first reading, by the reassurance. I had returned to it, on subsequent readings, and found the comfort diminished and replaced by a question that the note answered and did not answer simultaneously. Safe from what? Chapter 25. The weeks after. The weeks immediately following the cessation of the watching were, in some respects, stranger than the weeks of the watching itself. This is something I have heard from others who have experienced sustained surveillance or stalking, that the end of it, when it comes, does not restore the previous state. You do not simply return to the person you were before. The weeks of altered perception, of heightened attention, of the doubled consciousness that comes from being observed, these leave a residue. A recalibration has occurred. And the new calibration, while it may eventually settle into something habitable, is different from what preceded it. I still checked the camera footage every morning. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of habit. The checking had become part of the structure of the day, and removing it left a gap that felt more notable than the checking itself had. I still sometimes stood at the upstairs window in the dark and looked at the street. Not looking for anything specific. Just looking. As if the act of watching my own watching, from my own position, had become something I was reluctant to entirely relinquish. I thought about this. About the strange symmetry of it. 3 weeks of being watched, and at the end of it, watching. The habit of observation I had developed out of necessity, now untethered from its necessity, continuing as a kind of reflex. The watcher's watching had taught me to watch. I thought about whether that was the point. Lydia and I had several long conversations in this period about what we had both experienced, her stalking in Bristol, my 3 weeks, the notes, the question they had raised. We approached it from different angles, as we approached most things, and I found this generative. She was more practical in her orientation, I was more inclined to sit with questions. Between us, we assembled something that felt not like an answer, but like a coherent account of what we didn't know. What we didn't know. Who had been watching my house, and why? Not the guardian, the other watcher. The one who had preceded the guardian's intervention. The one about whom the note said, "It has not always been watching you." What it meant for something to watch a person before they were aware of being watched. What that prior watching period had been for. What information it had gathered, and what that information was used for. Who the guardian was, and what had qualified them for the role. Whether the role was chosen or assigned. Whether it was ongoing, whether, after the cessation of the watching at my house, the guardian had moved on to something or someone else. Whether there were others. Other people in the town or elsewhere, who were currently experiencing what I had experienced, who were feeling watched and finding nothing when they looked. Whether the feeling of being watched that many people experience, fleetingly attributing it to imagination, explaining it away, was always imagination, or whether, sometimes, it wasn't. This last question was the one that stayed with me longest. Chapter 26. The town's history. I began, in the months after the 3 weeks, to look more carefully at the town's history. Not from fear, not in a spirit of investigation, more from the particular curiosity that takes hold when you understand that a place has more to it than its surface suggests. The journalist in me reactivated. I spent time in the local archive. I spoke to people who had lived in the town for decades, older residents, people with long memories. I was careful about how I framed my questions, not wanting to create alarm or seem strange, but working around the edges of what I was actually asking. What I found was not dramatic. Nothing so legible as a clear historical incident or a documented series of events that mapped neatly onto what had happened to me. But there were threads. Over the decades, the archive went back nearly a century. There were a handful of cases, scattered and apparently unconnected, of residents who had reported unusual experiences. Feelings of surveillance. Objects moved. Notes of unclear origin. In the older cases, these had been attributed to local superstition and documented with the mild condescension that official records tend to apply to such things. Resident reports disturbances of an unspecified nature, no evidence of criminal activity found. More recently, within the last 20 years, there were 3 formal police reports of harassment by unknown parties that had never been resolved. 2 of them matched, in their outlines, what I knew of the other cases Constable Reeves had found. The third was different. The third was from 14 years ago. The complainant was a woman who had lived, at the time of her report, in a house on a street 2 blocks from mine. Her report described not a watcher outside the house, but a watcher inside it. Or rather, the impression of a watcher inside it. A consistent sense, over several months, that she was being observed from within her own walls. From corners. From behind doors left slightly ajar. She had found no evidence of intrusion, no signs of anyone having been inside the house, no material trace of any other presence. She had eventually left the house, as the notes in the archive recorded with their characteristic brevity. Complainant relocated, case closed, no further action. I looked up whether anyone had lived in that house after her. The house had stood empty for 6 years. Then it had been sold. Sold again. Currently occupied by a retired couple who, as far as I could establish, had experienced nothing unusual. I stood outside that house on a bright November morning and looked at it. An ordinary house. A front garden slightly better maintained than mine. Net curtains. Ordinary. I went home. But I noted, in my notebook. Inside, not outside. Different direction. Same quality. Same absence of cause. Chapter 27. What Lydia remembered. 3 months after the end of the 3 weeks, Lydia told me something else. Something she had remembered, or something that had connected in her memory, a delayed recognition that sometimes happens when you have been carrying 2 pieces of a puzzle separately and have not yet placed them against each other. She had been in Bristol during her stalking. Walking home from work one evening, early in the period when she had first noticed she was being followed. She had turned a corner and nearly walked into a person coming the other way, a near collision, the kind that happens on busy pavements. She had apologized, as you do. The other person had looked at her. She described them as nondescript, not tall, not short, no remarkable features, the kind of person your eye slides off. But they had said something to her. They had said, "Be careful getting home." She had taken this as a generic pleasantry, the kind of thing you might say after a near collision on a dark evening, a filler phrase for an awkward micro-interaction. She had not thought about it again until now. 3 months into my experience here, she said, I keep thinking about that. Be careful getting home. Was it a warning? Was it she stopped? Was that them? Was that the guardian that early? Watching the thing that was watching me, from the very beginning, before I even knew I was being watched. I thought about it. Or, I said carefully, was it the thing that was watching you? Was it announcing itself? Warning you without telling you what to be warned of? We looked at each other. I don't know how to answer that, she said. No, I said. Neither do I. Chapter 28. The question of purpose. There is a question that I have returned to many times, and that I want to address carefully and honestly, without either overstating or minimizing. Why? Not why did a person stand outside my house for 3 weeks. I don't know the answer to that, in the sense of the immediate, specific motivation. But why, at a larger scale? What was the point of the watching? What was being accomplished? In conventional stalking cases, the motivation is usually legible even when it is irrational. Obsession, desire, grievance, the need to feel connected to or in control of another person. The watching serves a psychological need in the watcher. What I experienced did not feel like any of these things. The patient precision of it, the forensic awareness, the complete absence of any demand or statement of grievance or indication of personal relationship, it did not feel like obsession or desire. It felt like documentation. The watching felt like record keeping. Like something was gathering information. Not about my movements in the practical sense, where I went, what I did, who I saw. But something more fundamental. Something about me, in some register I can't fully identify. The way a scientist observes a subject not making contact, not interfering with the natural behavior, simply watching in order to know. But what kind of knowing requires watching a specific person's house at night for 3 weeks? And what was the third note's watcher watching the watcher for? Was it also documentation? Was it monitoring a documentation process? Was the whole layered structure watcher, guardian, and whatever had been watching before either a nested system of observation whose purpose and whose origin were far removed from anything I could identify? I don't know. But I notice that I am still asking. And I notice that the asking feels important in a way I can't fully rationalize. Chapter 29. The conversation with Marcus. Marcus came to visit 2 months after the end of the 3 weeks. He had been following the case from a distance, calls, messages, reviews of the footage I sent him, and he wanted to see the place, the street, the house. I showed him around. The tree. The camera position. The gate where I had seen hands. The fanlight I had crouched at. The places where notes had been found. He listened and looked with the careful attention of someone constructing a mental model. In the evening we sat in the kitchen and talked. Marcus, who had spent his career documenting human behavior in its most extreme registers, who was not given to mysticism or loose framing, who chose his words with a precision I had always admired, Marcus said, "The thing that stays with me about all of this is the note. The third one. Because of what it implies about the watcher's knowledge." "What do you mean?" "To write you are safe from what I am watching, to phrase it as safe from what I am watching and not safe from who I am watching, to write it has not always been watching you. Whoever wrote that note had to have a very specific kind of knowledge. They had to know not just that there was something watching you, but what that something was. What category it belonged to. They had to know the nature of the thing well enough to say you were safe from it as long as they were watching it." He paused. "And they had to know that telling you what the thing was, or telling you directly, would not serve you. That you needed to be told only that you were safe. That the details were either not yours to have yet, or not possible to give." I sat with this. "Or," I said, "they couldn't give the details. Not because I wasn't ready for them, but because the details aren't transmittable in language. Because whatever they're watching isn't the kind of thing you can describe in a note and have the description be accurate." Marcus looked at me. "Yes," he said. "That's the other option." Chapter 30. The Library. 6 months after the end of the 3 weeks, I was at the town library. A Tuesday afternoon. The library is a place I have always used as a kind of heaven, the particular silence of it, the quality of time that accumulates in rooms full of books, the way you can be in the middle of a town and feel, in a library, both present in the world and partially removed from it. I was at a table in the reference section, working. Not on anything to do with the case, just ordinary work. A piece I was writing for a magazine about something entirely unrelated. I had been there for about an hour when I became aware of someone at the table across from me. Not the awareness of another library user. The other awareness. The one I had developed over 3 weeks and then, partially, retained. I looked up. A person sat across from me. Not at my table, at the adjacent one, perpendicular, facing a different direction. Reading. Average height, nondescript features, the kind of person your eye moves over without anchoring. I looked at them for a moment. They did not look up. I returned to my work. I stayed in the library for another 40 minutes and left when I had finished what I was doing. As I gathered my things, I glanced at the adjacent table. The person was gone. I had not heard them leave. There was a small piece of paper on the table where they had been sitting. I almost didn't take it. Almost left it there, for whatever it was, a used shopping list, a bookmark, something dropped without intention. But I took it. It said, "You have asked good questions. The asking is the point. Keep asking." I stood in the library for a long moment, holding this. Then I folded it once and put it in my pocket. And I walked home. Chapter 31. What keeps? I have been asked, by the several people I have shared this account with in various stages of its telling, what the lasting effect of it has been. What it left. What is different about the person on the other side of the 3 weeks compared to the person before them? I have tried to answer this honestly. What is different? The quality of my attention. Not hypervigilance in the pathological sense. I did not develop anxiety that required treatment, did not avoid ordinary life in the ways that trauma sometimes produces. But a changed baseline. A recalibration. I noticed things I did not notice before. Not looking for threat, I am not, most of the time, operating from a position of anticipated threat. But noticing the texture of the ordinary world as it presents itself in any given moment. The quality of attention in a room. The particular way a person is still versus the many ways a person is still. I also notice the question more. The one I have been circling in this account and have not yet asked directly, because I am not sure asking it directly is useful without the context that surrounds it. What was watching me? The person with hands on my gate. I have a working theory, though not a confirmed one, about who that was and what motivated them. The theory involves no supernatural element. It involves a person with a specific kind of damage and a specific mode of channeling it, and it is, in its human dimensions, both sad and frightening. But the thing the guardian was watching. The thing with many watchers. The thing whose attention to me was not constant but had, at some point, become so. What was that? I don't know. I have spent significant time in the assumption that it is something with a human explanation. Something technical or social or institutional, a surveillance operation of some kind, something related to my past as a journalist, something that I brushed against without knowing it, and that has been tangentially present in my life since. But there are moments, usually late, usually in the particular quality of quiet that the house has in the early morning hours when Lydia is asleep and the street is empty, when I look at the window and feel the house around me, feel its solidness, its history, its particularity as a place that exists in a specific location in the world, and I think about the notes, about the phrasing, about the things that are not described in language that maps onto anything I can name. And I think, what if the simplest explanation is not, in this case, the most accurate one? What if the thing watching me was not something that human intelligence had constructed? What if it was older than that? What if it was watching for reasons that had nothing to do with anything I had done or written or known or been, and everything to do with what I was? What I am? What all of us are? I sit with this in the early morning dark, and the house is very quiet, and outside the window the street is empty. The tree is there. The gate is closed. And I think about the note in the library. The asking is the point. And I think, yes. Maybe that's it. Maybe the point is not the finding. Maybe the point is the person who cannot stop looking. Chapter 32. Coda. I have lived in the house for 26 months now. The second year has been quieter than the first, in the relevant sense. The feeling has not returned in its nightly form. There have been occasional moments, nothing I can describe with precision, nothing I would ask anyone else to take seriously as evidence, of a quality I have come to think of as residual. A faint echo, perhaps, of something that has passed. Or a reminder, perhaps, that the passing was not the same as the ending. Lydia is here. This is, all things considered, the most significant outcome of the 3 weeks. The thing that found me, or that I found by being found, in the process of going through something I would not have chosen. Reeves retired from the police force last spring. He sent me a brief note. He said that the case remained open but inactive, and that he hoped I was well. I wrote back and said I was. Marcus made a documentary about an entirely different subject. He mentioned, in an email about something else, that he thought about the Ridgeback case sometimes. I wasn't sure which Ridgeback case he meant. I had told him about both, the signal and the street, and when I asked, he said, both. They're not as different as they seem. I thought about that for a long time. I want to end with something I have been carrying for the entirety of this account, holding back because it doesn't fit neatly, and I wasn't sure it was mine to share. But it is mine. It happened to me. On the last night of the 3 weeks, the Tuesday night when the feeling didn't come, when I stood at the upstairs window and looked at the empty street and felt nothing, I was about to step back from the window when I saw something. Not the figure. Not a person. A light. In the upper window of the house directly opposite mine. A house I had looked at every night for 3 weeks and seen nothing in. Curtained, dark, apparently unoccupied in its upper floor. A light. Brief, perhaps 2 seconds. The warm color of a lamp rather than the cold color of a phone screen. Turned on and then off. As if acknowledging, from across the street, that I was at the window. That I had seen what needed to be seen. That the night's watching was done. I looked at the window for a long time after the light went out. Then I drew the curtain. And I thought, the asking is the point. And I went to bed. And I slept better than I had in 3 weeks. Something was out there. I have never claimed to know what it was. I have never claimed the watching was benign or that the reassurance in the notes was warranted or that whatever unnamed thing the guardian was guarding against was genuinely something I needed guarding from. I only know what I experienced. What I documented. What I found when I looked, and what I didn't find, and what found me instead. I know that 3 weeks of being watched by something I couldn't identify changed the quality of my attention permanently. I know that something was watching the watching. I know that a light came on in an empty window on the last night, and went off again, and the feeling never came back. I know that in a library 6 months later, someone I couldn't describe left a note that said, "Keep asking." I am keeping asking. This account is the asking. You, reading this, your attention, your sustained presence with these words through all of what this account has described, you are also part of the asking. I think that matters. I think someone, somewhere, is aware that it does. End of story. Someone has been watching my house for 3 weeks. A Whisper Void documentary narrative. All characters and events are fictional. All feelings are real. Chapter 33. The Mechanics of Being Watched. Before I continue with the extended account, I want to describe something that I have not yet described with the precision it deserves. The physical and psychological mechanics of the experience itself. The day-to-day texture of living under sustained observation. I have given you the incidents, the sightings, the notes, the camera footage. What I have not fully given you is the interior of it. The fine grain. The experience of being watched, when it becomes a sustained condition rather than a passing moment, creates what I can only describe as a permanent alteration in the quality of your presence in your own life. Most of the time, in ordinary circumstances, you exist inside your experience without being aware of it as a container. You move through your house, your day, your relationships, without a continuous narrative tracking the movement. You are simply in it. Being watched removes this. Or rather, it adds something to it. A layer. A secondary channel, running alongside the primary experience, translating it into the terms of the watcher. This secondary channel is exhausting not because it is frightening, fear spikes and passes, but because it is continuous. You cannot turn it off. You can ignore it for periods, but it does not stop. It runs underneath your thoughts like a second soundtrack, noting. You are in the kitchen, the window faces north, someone might be at the north wall. You are in the living room, the curtains are drawn, but the gap at the left edge is approximately 3 centimeters. You are walking up the stairs, your silhouette is visible through the frosted glass of the landing window if anyone on the street is at the right angle. You begin to know your house as a watched object. To understand its visual exposure, its sight lines, its vulnerabilities in the specific sense of what can be seen from where. This knowledge is, once acquired, very difficult to unknow. I know it still. I know my house in this way now. I know which rooms are visible from the street and from what angles and under what lighting conditions. I know where the shadows fall. I know what the figure at my gate would have been able to see of the hallway through the fanlight and what the slight angle would have obscured. I did not know any of this before. The watching taught me the house the way the house would be known by someone watching it. I have thought about this a great deal. About what it means to come to know your home primarily as an object of observation rather than as the place of your own habitation. There is something destabilizing about it that goes beyond discomfort, something that touches the relationship between self and place in a way that ordinary fear does not. Home is where you are the subject. Where the perspective centers on you. Where the walls exist to contain your life, not to frame it for someone else's view. To have your home reframed as an observed space, to have the outside looking in become the dominant orientation, is to have something fundamental about the experience of being there quietly and persistently inverted. I lived with this inversion for 3 weeks, and its traces took months to fade, and some traces, I think, will not fade entirely. I am not sure that is entirely a loss. Chapter 34. What observation does to time. The other thing I want to describe carefully is what the experience did to my sense of time. The first few evenings, when the feeling was new and not yet confirmed, time had the quality of anticipation. I was waiting for something, waiting to understand what the feeling was, waiting for it to resolve into either explanation or confirmation. This is a familiar human relationship with time. The waiting for something quality, which has a kind of focus to it even when the something is undefined. By the end of the first week, after the first sighting, time had changed character. It was no longer anticipatory but suspended. Something was happening, had been confirmed to be happening, but it was not resolving. It was not building toward a moment. It was simply continuing. Each evening was the same evening, in some essential way. The same quality. The same ritual of feeling, checking, finding nothing, logging, sleeping poorly. This sameness, paradoxically, made the days feel longer. Not in the way that boredom extends time, boredom has a particular thin, flat quality, but in a denser way. More textured. Each day carried more, weighed more, deposited more in whatever register of experience holds things that matter. By the middle of the second week, time had acquired a quality I can only describe as watchful. as if time itself was attending to something. The minutes did not pass with their usual unnoticed smoothness, but moved with a kind of deliberateness, each one presenting itself as a unit of attention rather than simply occurring. I noticed this particularly in the late evenings, in the period between when I went upstairs to look at the street and when I went to sleep. The hour between about 10 and 11 p.m. had a quality unlike any other part of the day. A fullness. A sense of being at the center of something even while not knowing what the something was. This is not a comfortable sensation. But I want to record it accurately, because it was real, and because it is different from the simpler account I could give, the account in which being watched is simply frightening, and the emotional texture is one of straightforward fear and relief at resolution. The actual texture was more complex than that, and the complexity is, I think, part of the truth of what happened. Chapter 35. Constable Reeves. A portrait. I want to give you a fuller sense of Constable Reeves, because I think he is an important figure in this story, and I have described him only functionally as the police contact, the professional, the person who took the statements and reviewed the footage and sent things for forensic analysis. He was more than that. He was a man in his mid-40s who had, by the evidence of the way he inhabited his job, made a particular kind of peace with the limitations of what the system he worked within could accomplish. This is not the same as cynicism. Cynics disengage from the limitation. Reeves had engaged with it in a way that produced not bitterness but a particular quality of attention to what was possible within the constraint. He was skilled, in other words, at working in the gap between what ought to be possible and what actually was. He had been on the force for 22 years. He was, I gathered, well regarded in the way that people who do their work quietly and well over a long period tend to be, not celebrated, not spectacular, but reliable. The person other people came to when something was complicated and needed to be thought through carefully. He visited the house 4 times in the course of the investigation. Each visit was purposeful and contained. He looked at things carefully. He asked good questions, the questions that revealed a prior thinking through of the situation, not the questions you ask when you are gathering initial information but the questions you ask when you have formed a partial model and are testing it. He was not dismissive of the elements of the case that were harder to account for. The note in the letterbox with no corresponding camera footage. The third note's content. The suggestion of a watcher watching the watcher. He neither embraced these as something extraordinary nor explained them away. He held them, documented them, and noted that they complicated the picture. This seemed to me the appropriate response. I appreciated it. After he retired, he sent me a note. Not an official communication, a personal one, handwritten, on plain card. It said, "I hope the quiet has stayed. I sometimes think about the third note. I don't think it's resolvable, for what it's worth. Some things aren't. But I don't think that makes the asking the wrong thing to do." I kept that note. Chapter 36. What Lydia knew about watchers. Over the months following the 3 weeks, Lydia and I had a number of long conversations about the nature of watching as a phenomenon, not just in the context of our own experiences, but more broadly. She had, it turned out, thought about this more carefully than I had. She had a framework for it that she had developed, she said, partly as a way of processing what had happened in Bristol, and partly because landscape architecture, her profession, involves a very particular relationship with observation. The design of spaces, she explained, is fundamentally about the management of sightlines. What can be seen from where observation is invited and where it is blocked. The way a landscape can make you feel exposed or contained or guided. All of this requires thinking carefully about who is watching what from where and with what effect. The thing people don't fully account for, she said, is that being watched and watching are not symmetrical experiences. They feel like they should be, they are the two poles of the same relationship, but the person being watched has a fundamentally different experience from the person watching. Not just emotionally. Epistemologically. What do you mean? The watcher has information. They can see you, they can observe your patterns, they can build a picture of you over time. The person being watched, without knowing they're being watched, has no corresponding information about the watcher. There's an asymmetry of knowledge that is fundamental to the power dynamic. The watcher knows the watched doesn't know the watcher at all. She paused. But there's a second asymmetry that people think about less. The watcher chooses what to watch. They decide where to look, when to look, what to pay attention to. They exercise a kind of editorial judgment over what becomes known. The person being watched, by contrast, is not selecting. They are simply existing. They don't know which of their actions are being observed and which are not. They have no control over what aspects of themselves are being transmitted. I thought about this. In landscape design, she said, you have to think about this carefully. Because a space that makes people feel watched, even if no one is actually watching, changes behavior. People don't act naturally in spaces where they feel observed. They perform. They edit. The architecture of observation is also the architecture of performance. The house became that, I said. Yes. You started performing in it. Not consciously. But the second channel, the one that notes where the windows are and what the sight lines are, that's a performance register. That's you adapting to an audience. I had not thought about it in those terms. The word performance did something to my understanding of those 3 weeks that I found useful and uncomfortable in equal measure. The notes, she said, were interesting in this context. Because they broke the asymmetry. They were communication. They introduced you to the watcher, not identically, not fully, but they confirmed the watcher's existence and attributed a purpose to the watching. And they changed the dynamic. How? They made you a participant rather than just a subject. Up to the notes, you were being watched without consent or awareness. The notes made you aware. They gave you a role. Not the role of an equal, you still didn't know who or what was doing the watching, but not entirely the role of an unwitting object. She thought for a moment. The third note went further. The third note told you that you were being protected. It gave you a position in a structure. It told you that the watching had a framework and that you were inside that framework in a specific way. She paused. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a significant thing to be told. It raised more questions than it answered. Yes. But it told you that the questions had answers, even if it couldn't give them. That's different from confusion. That's mystery, which is something else entirely. I thought about the difference between confusion and mystery for a long time. Chapter 37. The other cases. I want to return, at greater length, to the other cases that Constable Reeves identified. The 4 people whose experiences had resembled mine over the 7 years preceding my own case. I have been in contact since the account of my 3 weeks became known in the small community of people who follow these things, with 2 of them. I will describe their experiences as they shared them with me, with their agreement, without identifying details. The first, who I will call D, was a man in his 50s at the time of his experience, which occurred 3 years before mine. He was a retired teacher, a widower, who had lived in the town for many years. His experience had begun in spring rather than autumn, warmer, lighter evenings, which made the watching simultaneously more and less visible. More visible because there was longer daylight, less visible because the longer evenings meant the transition to darkness that seemed to activate the feeling happened later and more gradually. D's description of the feeling was remarkably similar to mine. The same directionality. The same persistence despite investigation. The same quality of patience, of something not in a hurry, not escalating, not threatening in any explicit way. Just present. He had not received any notes. His case had ended without communication from the watcher, without any contact at all. The watching had simply stopped, after approximately 5 weeks. He had not known why. He had, he said, spent considerable time afterward trying to understand whether the cessation represented a conclusion or an interruption. It felt like being released, he said. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. More like the way a tension releases. Something that had been maintaining a particular condition simply stopped maintaining it. And the condition relaxed. Did you feel differently about the house after? He was quiet for a moment. I felt that the house had a history I hadn't known about before, he said. That there was something in its past, or in its position, or in its location that made it part of something. I couldn't define what. But the sense that it was simply a house in a row of houses on an ordinary street, I couldn't fully recover that. I understood exactly what he meant. He had stayed. He was still there. He had, over the 3 years since, neither repeated the experience nor lived in fear of it. But he had remained attentive in the way that I recognized the altered baseline, the recalibrated awareness. Do you think it will happen again? I asked. I think it was complete, he said. I think what it needed to do, it did. Whatever that was. What do you think it needed to do? He thought for a long time. I think it needed to be known, he said. Not understood. Just known. Acknowledged. The fact of it. I think whatever it was, it needed someone to know it was there. The second person I spoke with, who I will call R, had a different experience, one that fit the structural pattern but varied significantly in some details. R was a woman in her early 40s when her experience occurred, 4 years before mine. She had moved to the town recently at that time, as I had. She was a scientist, a marine biologist, working remotely. She was, by her own description, significantly more empirically minded than I was, and significantly less inclined toward interpretive frameworks of the kind that I have been using throughout this account. Her experience had been shorter than mine, 11 days. But more intense. The feeling had been present not just in the evenings but throughout the day. She had felt watched from early morning. She had felt watched while she worked, while she ate, while she moved through the ordinary functions of her day in her rented cottage on the edge of the town. And she had, unlike thee or me, felt watched from multiple directions simultaneously. Not sequentially, she said. Not the feeling coming from the front, then later from the back, then from the side. At the same time. Several points of attention, all directed at me, all at once. This was qualitatively different from what I had experienced, and I asked her to describe it more carefully. It felt like I was the center of a pattern, she said. Like I was a point and the watching was radiating outward from me, or inward toward me. I could never quite determine the direction. But the sensation of being at the center of something. Not surrounded, exactly. More like contained within something that was examining the fact of me. Contained within what? I asked. She shook her head. I never found out. And honestly, that's the part I've thought about most in the years since. Not the watching itself. The sense of containment. The sense that I was inside something that was, simultaneously, paying very close attention to me. Were you afraid? She considered this. In the first few days, yes. Conventionally afraid, looked for intruders, called the police, all of that. But by the second week, something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was underneath something else. Something that wasn't fear. What was it? She looked at me with a directness that I found striking. I think it was recognition, she said. The same thing Owen Price described, with the signal. The feeling of being seen completely and found not lacking. Found sufficient. She paused. I'm a scientist. I don't usually reach for words like that. But that's the most accurate description I have. Chapter 38. The Architecture of Watching. After my conversations with D and R, and in the context of my ongoing discussions with Lydia, I began to think about what all of these experiences had in common at a structural level. Not the content, the specific feelings, the sightings, the notes, but the architecture. The underlying shape. Every case, including my own, involved the same basic structure. A person, going about their life in an ordinary way, in an ordinary place. A sustained period of observation, not aggressive, not escalating, simply persistent. An inability, on the part of the person being observed, to identify the observer through conventional means. A cessation, at some point, that had the quality of completion rather than interruption. And, in most cases, not all, but most, some element of communication. A note, a gesture, a look. Something that broke the pure asymmetry of the watching and introduced, briefly, a form of address. What struck me, thinking about this structure, was how different it was from stalking in the conventional sense. Conventional stalking is about a relationship, real or imagined, desired or grievance-driven, between two specific people. The stalker is interested in the person as a specific individual. They want something from them, or want to express something to them, or are obsessed with the particular qualities that make them them. The watching in my case, and in DS and RS and in the others, had a different quality. Not personal in the sense of being about a relationship between two people. Personal in a different sense, the sense of being, specifically and unmistakably, about that person. But not about them as an individual in a social network, a person with a history and relationships and a role. About them as I kept reaching for the right word, as an instance. a specific occurrence of something more general. The watching was about what they were, not who. And what they were, what we all were, in these cases was a consciousness, a point of awareness, a place where experience was occurring. Chapter 39. Questions I cannot answer. I want to lay out, with as much honesty as I can manage, the questions that this account raises and that I cannot answer. First, who was the person at my gate? Who stood across the street under the tree? Who left the notes? This person, human, flesh and blood, making choices and taking deliberate actions, has never been identified. The investigation is technically still open. I have no theory, and I want to resist the temptation to construct one from insufficient evidence. What I know is, someone was there. Someone chose to be there for 3 weeks with a care and a deliberateness that speaks to a specific purpose. I don't know what that purpose was. Second, what was the guardian watching? The third note introduces the concept of something being watched, something other than me, something the guardian was monitoring. I have speculated about this. I have declined to share my speculations in this account because I genuinely cannot distinguish between a well-grounded hypothesis and a construction built from wish and fear. What I can say is that the question has not left me. That I think about it often. That I have, over time, developed a tentative orientation toward it that I might describe as, I believe there is an answer, and I believe it is not one I am currently capable of receiving. Not because I lack courage or intelligence, I like to think I have sufficient of both, but because the answer may require a different kind of knowing than the kind I currently have access to. Third, why the town? 4 cases over 7 years, plus mine, in a specific location. Is the location significant? Is there something about this particular place, this geography, this history, that draws or generates or is associated with whatever is happening here? I have looked for answers in the archive, in conversations with long-term residents, in the records of local events. I have found the threads I described earlier, the older cases, the patterns of unusual experience reaching back decades. But threads are not explanations, and I am wary of the confirmation bias that any investigative process tends to introduce. You find what you are looking for, and what you find looks like evidence of what you were looking for, and the circularity is not always visible from inside it. Fourth, what changed? DS experience ended. Mine ended. RS ended. The watching stopped. Why? In each case, the cessation had the quality of completion, as if something had concluded rather than been interrupted. But what had concluded? What was accomplished? In the absence of communication that explained it, I am left with the shape of the thing beginning, middle, end without understanding what the narrative was. Chapter 40. On the nature of observation. I want to step back from the specific events and spend some time on the general phenomenon. Observation is not neutral. This is something that physics has confirmed at the quantum level, and that psychology has confirmed at the human level, and that philosophy has long asserted. To observe something is to affect it. The act of watching changes what is watched. This is, at the quantum level, a statement about measurement and wave function collapse and the role of the observer in determining the state of a system. I do not want to overextend this principle beyond its domain. The quantum behavior of subatomic particles does not map directly onto the experience of a person being watched from across the street. But the underlying insight, that observation is not passive, that there is no such thing as a perfectly transparent observer who leaves no trace, has resonances in the human domain that are worth thinking about carefully. When someone watches you, something happens. Not just in you, in the relationship between you and them, in the dynamic of the space you share, in the way the situation is shaped. The act of watching is participatory. It is not merely receiving information, it is creating a field of attention that changes what is within it. The 3 weeks taught me this. The watching from outside my house did not leave the outside unchanged. It did not leave me unchanged. It created a field, the field of sustained attention, that I have been trying to describe throughout this account, and that field shaped everything within it. My behavior, my perception, my relationship to my home and to the time I spent in it. The watching changed me. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would be visible from outside. But irrevocably, in the sense that the changed version of me cannot change back. Cannot unknow what the watching taught me about the house, about attention, about the felt quality of being observed. This is what prolonged observation does. And if this is what human observation does, observation by a person with a body and a position and a finite capacity to observe, what would the observation of something larger do? Something not constrained by the limits of a human body's position in space. Something capable of sustained attention over longer intervals, from more angels, at a different scale. I am not claiming to know what such an observer would be. I am only following the logic of the question. Chapter 41. The House at Night. I want to describe the house as I know it now, at night, when the street is quiet. The front room, with its 2 windows facing the street. The curtains I draw at dusk. The lamp in the corner that I leave on later than I used to, not from fear, simply from a preference for light that I did not have before. The way the room sounds at midnight. The fridge from the kitchen, the occasional car, the wind when it moves through the gap in the upstairs window frame that I have not yet sealed. The hallway, with the fanlight beside the front door. The mail slot. The stairs rising on the right. The smell of old wood that the house has, and that I have come to associate with the house's specific quality of age, the decades it has been here, the succession of lives it has contained. The kitchen at the back, with the window over the sink that faces the passage between my house and the neighbor's fence. The motion sensor light on the neighbor's garage that activates sometimes in the night when the fox passes. The garden beyond, walled, quiet. The stairs. The landing. The bathroom, small, window frosted. The bedroom, where the window faces the street and where I stood, on so many evenings, looking down at the tree and the pavement and the gate and the person who was sometimes there and often wasn't. The house. My house. A Victorian house built in the 1890s, narrow, 2 stories, a particular piece of the world that I chose and that has, over the course of the events I have described, chosen me back in some way I do not fully understand. I think about who lived here before me. Not in a supernatural sense, I am not suggesting the house is haunted, not in any conventional way. But in the straightforward sense of recognizing that a house of this age has been the container for many lives. Has been the specific space within which many people experienced whatever they experienced. Has been, For each of its inhabitants, the place that the world looked like from the inside. Each of those people had their experience of the house. Each of them felt watched at some point, or felt safe, or felt the particular middle of the night quality that old houses have. Each of them knew this house the way I know it, through the accumulation of time spent inside it. And now I know it also in the other way. In the way of someone who has seen it from outside, the way it looks to a person standing in the street at night. Both ways. Chapter 42. On staying. I was advised, at one point in the 3 weeks, to leave. To stay elsewhere. Constable Reeves had suggested it, carefully, as a practical precaution. The logic was sound. If you are the subject of unwanted surveillance, reducing your predictability reduces the surveillance's effectiveness. I had refused. I want to think about why, now, with more distance. Partly it was stubbornness. I had moved to that house with intention. I was not going to be moved out of it by a pressure I couldn't fully name. This is, I recognize, a response that can be both admirable and foolish depending on the circumstances, and I am not certain it was the right response in mine. But it was honest. Partly it was something more considered. I had thought about what leaving would mean, and I had reached the conclusion that the watching, whatever it was, whoever was doing it, was not, in any register I could access, something that leaving would resolve. If something had been watching before I knew it was watching, then the watching had continued through all the ordinary circumstances of my life up to that point. Moving to someone else's house for a few weeks would be moving within a life that was already, apparently, the kind of life that attracted this attention. The watching was about me, wherever I was. This thought, I want to be clear, was not reassuring. But it was clarifying. And the third reason I stayed was something I could only articulate fully in retrospect. I stayed because I did not believe the watching was malevolent. I had no evidence for this belief. It was not a conclusion drawn from observation. It was more like a perception. An impression. The feeling, available to me from the very beginning, but not trusted until much later, that whatever was present outside my house was not there to hurt me. I am aware that this feeling could be wrong. That this kind of perception is exactly the kind of perception that people with dangerous fixations can exploit. I am aware that being certain you are not in danger is not the same as not being in danger. But the feeling was real. And in the end, it was accurate. The 3 weeks ended without incident. I was not harmed. Whatever the watching was, it concluded, as Dee had said his experience had concluded, with a quality of completion. I stayed because I believed, somehow, that staying was the appropriate response to whatever was happening. That leaving would be leaving the conversation before it had ended. I think I was right. Chapter 43. The town in winter. The winter after the 3 weeks was very cold. I mention this not because it is relevant in any direct way but because the season is part of the texture of the time. The town in winter has a particular quality. The trees stripped bare, the mornings slow to brighten, the evenings arriving early and staying. The kind of cold that makes each outdoor excursion a negotiation with the weather rather than a background condition. I found, during this winter, that I liked the town more than I had before the 3 weeks. This surprised me. I would have predicted that the experience of being watched in a place would sour the experience of that place, would make it feel unsafe, make it carry a residue of the specific discomfort of those weeks. And to some extent it did. I have described the ways in which the house was changed permanently by the experience. But the town itself, the wider town, the streets and the shops and the library and the park where I ran in the mornings felt more mine than before. More known. Not because I knew it better in any objective sense, I had not discovered things about it that I hadn't known. But the relationship had deepened in the way that relationships deepen through difficulty. Through having been tested. I had been in the town for a year and a half when the 3 weeks began, and I had been in it comfortably but lightly. The way you inhabit a new place when you haven't yet made full claim to it, when you are still a little bit a visitor in your own life. The 3 weeks had changed this. The experience of being observed in a place, and of having to defend your presence there, not against the watcher, but in your own interior, against the impulse to leave, had rooted me in a way that ordinary time might not have. Lydia had said something about this, in the context of her own experience. That the thing had driven her from Bristol but had, in retrospect, also given her Bristol. Had made it fully real to her in a way she had not been before the stalking. Had given her a relationship to the place, antagonistic, eventually resolved, but real, that the time before had not quite achieved. The price was too high, she said. I don't want to romanticize it. But the reality is, it happened, and I know Bristol in my bones in a way I might not otherwise. I understood this. I knew my town differently after. Not better, in any simple sense. But fully. Unavoidably. As a place where something real had happened to me, and where I had remained. Chapter 44. Lydia's experience extended. I asked Lydia, at some point in the winter, whether she would tell me more about Bristol. Not just the practical outline she had given me earlier, but the experience itself. She thought about it for a few days and then agreed, on the condition that I use it carefully and not in a way that was identifiable. She had been living in Bristol for 6 years at the point when her experience began. She had a flat in a neighborhood she loved, work she found meaningful, a life that had, after a difficult few years following a long relationship's ending, achieved a kind of equilibrium. She was not, she said, at the happiest point of her life, but she was at a stable one. She felt rooted. The watching began in late winter, February, cold, the city grey. She became aware of it the way I had. Gradually, through a feeling first, then through the confirmation of seeing someone who seemed to be present with intention rather than by chance. In her case, the person appeared at multiple locations, not just outside her flat, but near her workplace, in the area of the park she ran in, outside the cafe she used regularly. They always kept a distance, she said. Never close enough to be confrontable. Never so obvious that I could be certain initially. It was always at the edge of the plausible. The person who might be there for other reasons. She had reported it to the police. She had been taken seriously, to a point they had increased patrols in her area and taken a statement and logged it. No one had been identified. After 2 months, she had begun to consider leaving. Not dramatically, she had not been threatened, had not been followed in a way that felt aggressive. But the accumulation was its own kind of weight. The way every public space had been colonized by the awareness of the possible presence. The way ordinary errands had acquired a background of surveillance that she couldn't switch off. The thing that made me decide to actually leave, she said, was not the following itself. It was what it was doing to my attention. I realized I had stopped being fully present anywhere. Because I was always partly dedicated to scanning for the person. And I thought, if I can't be fully present in my own life, I've already lost something that I'm not sure I can get back. She had moved. She had returned home. And the person, whoever they had been, had not followed. Or had not appeared to follow. I think about that sometimes, she said. Whether they followed, and I just didn't notice. Whether the shift in my attention, the relief of being somewhere new, of not being primed to look for them, meant that I stopped noticing what I might have continued to notice had I stayed. She paused. Whether my sense of safety, once I moved, was real or whether it was just the absence of the signal that I had been trained to look for. This was, I thought, one of the most carefully considered things anyone had said to me about any of this. Chapter 45. The Dog. In late January, Lydia brought a dog. Not permanently, she was looking after it for a friend who was traveling, and the arrangement was meant to last 2 weeks. But the dog, a medium-sized, amiably scruffy terrier mix named Gus, stayed longer, by mutual agreement, and is still here, as I write this, occupying a significant portion of the sofa and exercising an apparently boundless curiosity about the garden. I did not expect the dog to be relevant to this account. But it was, in one specific way that I want to record. Dogs notice things. Not in the same way humans notice things, and not with the same frameworks of interpretation, but with a directness of attention that humans, who are always running their perceptions through layers of context and meaning, sometimes lack. A dog does not decide whether to notice something, it simply notices. During the 3 weeks, if Gus had been there, I think the experience would have been different. Not because dogs are reliable detectors of the supernatural, they're not, and I'm not making that claim, but because another consciousness sharing the space would have changed the texture of the experience. The particular quality of alone that the watching produced. But in January, with the 3 weeks behind me, and the house returned to its ordinary quiet, I noticed something about Gus that is worth recording. There are specific places in the house where Gus will not go. Not all of them, he moves freely through most of the rooms. But 2 spots. One is the corner of the upstairs landing, opposite the bathroom door. The other is the area immediately in front of the garden gate outside. He does not make noise about these places. He does not bark, does not growl, does not exhibit the overt behaviors associated with animal fear. He simply will not go there. He approaches to within a meter or 2, stops, and turns away. Without drama, without distress. Simply declines. I watched him do this several times before it occurred to me that both spots, the landing corner and the space in front of the garden gate, were places I had felt the watching most strongly. I have no explanation for this. I am not offering it as evidence of anything supernatural. Dogs avoid spaces for many reasons, and the reasons are often sensory and entirely mundane: a smell, a sound frequency, an air current. But I noticed it. And I recorded it. Because that is what I do now. Chapter 46. The 4th note. 8 months after the end of the 3 weeks, I received a 4th note. I had not expected this. The cessation had felt complete. I had not been waiting for further contact. The previous 3 notes had been tied to the period of active watching, and that period was over. The 4th note was different in every practical way from the first 3. It arrived in the mail, stamped, properly posted, delivered by the ordinary postal service in the ordinary way. The envelope was addressed by hand, in the same careful block script as the previous notes. The postmark was from a city I did not recognize, a large city, several hundred miles from where I lived, with no obvious connection to anything in my experience. Inside, one piece of plain paper. One sentence. It said, "When you are ready to know more, you will know where to look." I sat with this for a long time. I called Constable Reeves, even though he had retired. He listened and was quiet for a moment. "What do you make of it?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "I thought it was over." "Perhaps it is," he said. "Perhaps this is the close of it. Not an opening but a close." "How is that a close?" "When you are ready implies a future," he said. "But it also implies a condition. If you are not ready, you won't know where to look. If you never become ready, you may never need to know." I thought about this. "Do you think I should try to find out where to look?" I asked. A long pause. "I think," he said carefully, "that the note is telling you something important. That there is more. That it's available. That the availability is conditional on a state of readiness. Whether to try to achieve that state, or whether to allow it to come naturally, or whether to decide that you've had enough and close this chapter, those are all valid choices, and I don't think the note is trying to coerce you in any direction." He paused again. "What I will say," he added, "is that in my experience of people who have gone through things like this, the cases I've seen, the patterns I've observed over 22 years, the ones who try to force the readiness don't get what they're looking for. And the ones who simply continue living their lives with appropriate attention, they sometimes do." "Appropriate attention," I said. "Just that," he said. "No more." Chapter 47. On the literature of being watched. In the months following the 3 weeks, I read widely on the subject of surveillance, observation, and the experience of being watched. Not, primarily, the clinical or sociological literature, though I read some of that too, but the more personal accounts. The people who had written about their own experiences of unwanted observation, whether from other people or from systems or from the vaguer, less categorizable presences that show up in the stranger accounts. I found more of these than I expected. Not in mainstream publications, most of them existed in smaller venues, personal essays, self-published accounts, the archives of communities that gather around shared unusual experiences. But they existed. And the consistency across them was striking. Not the surface details, those varied enormously. But the interior experience. The alteration in the quality of attention. The specific exhaustion of sustained low-level vigilance. The strange relationship with time. The way ordinary domestic spaces acquire a new character. The shift from subject to object, and the partial impossibility of shifting fully back. People described this in different languages. Some used the language of the supernatural, some used the language of psychology, some used the language of social theory and the politics of surveillance. The languages were different. The experience they were describing was, at its core, the same. I found this, oddly, comforting. Not because community in shared suffering is a particularly robust form of comfort, but because it confirmed what I had suspected. That what I had experienced was a genuine category of human experience, not a private aberration. People had been through this before. Were going through it. Would go through it. And they had, in almost every case, continued. They had stayed, or left, or found out who was watching, or not found out. They had slept poorly and then slept again. They had checked the cameras and then, eventually, checked them less often. They had stood at windows in the dark and, eventually, stood there less. They had continued their lives. Changed, marked, differently attentive but continued. Chapter 48. What the town knows. I want to return, near the end of this extended account, to the town. To the place. I said earlier that I had been looking into the town's history in the archive, through conversations with long-term residents. I want to describe, in more detail, what I found. The town is old. Not remarkable for England, its age is not exceptional, but genuinely old, with a documented history going back several centuries and a geographical position that has made it, at various points, a waypoint. A place where routes crossed. A node in a network of connections that has changed its nature over the centuries but has persisted in one form or another. Old places accumulate. This is a banal observation, but I want to make it carefully. The accumulation is not simply of physical material, buildings, walls, the layers of construction and reconstruction that make up an old town's archaeology. It is also an accumulation of attention. Of human noticing. Centuries of people finding themselves in this particular location, looking at it from their specific present moments, giving it the quality of their awareness. A place that has been inhabited and observed for long enough develops, I think, a kind of depth. Not in any mystical sense, or not necessarily, but in the straightforward sense of having been the object of sustained human attention over a very long period. Of having been looked at, and described, and named, and thought about, by many people across many generations. This depth is not neutral. It accumulates as something. I do not know what to call it. The town, in the aggregate of its long being attended to, has a quality that a newer place does not have. A density of relation between the place and the people who have been in it. A quality that I, having now been watched within it, and having now attended to it in return, feel more keenly than I would have expected. I found, in the archive, descriptions of the town written at various points across 2 centuries. The language changes with the era: Victorian formality, Edwardian warmth, mid-century functionalism. But the descriptions have, underneath their differences, a consistent quality. The writers notice the same things. The particular light in the afternoons. The way sound carries in certain streets. The quality of quiet in the side passages between old houses. Generation after generation, different people, noticing the same things. There is something in the town that persists, and that keeps being noticed. I think the watching, whatever it was, wherever it came from, was part of that something. Part of what accumulates in a place that has been attended to for long enough. Part of what a place becomes when it has been inhabited by enough consciousness for enough time. This is speculation. I acknowledge it as speculation. But it is the closest I have come to a framework that accommodates everything I experienced and everything I subsequently found. Chapter 49. What I know now. I want to try to summarize, with as much precision as I can, what I actually know as distinct from what I believe, or what I wonder, or what I cannot quite rule out. I know that a person stood outside my house on multiple evenings over 3 weeks. I know this from direct observation and camera footage. The person was human, was deliberate, was careful about evidence. I do not know who they were. I know that I received 3 notes during this period, and a 4th note 8 months later, all in the same handwriting. I know that the notes offered reassurance, introduced the concept of a guardian watching a watcher, and, in the 4th, suggested that more information was available under conditions of readiness. I do not know who wrote them. I know that my camera footage was edited at some point, removing approximately 4 to 5 seconds of content around the time the 3rd note was delivered. I know that no one with authorized access to the camera system could have done this. I do not know who did. I know that Lydia had a prior experience in Bristol with structural similarities to mine. I know that Constable Reeves found 4 other cases in or near the town with similar structures. I do not know whether these cases are connected, though the circumstantial case for connection is significant. I know that D and R, 2 of the other cases, described experiences with a quality of completion at their end. The watching was accomplished rather than interrupted. I do not know what was accomplished. I know that I feel differently about attention, observation, and the interior of my own life than I did before. I know that this change is not entirely unwelcome. I know that I would not have chosen it, and I know that having gone through it, I would not choose to undo it. That is what I know. Everything else is question. Which is, perhaps, what the 4th note was trying to say. The questions are not obstacles to the answer. They are the approach toward it. Chapter 50. Letter to the next person. I want to include, in this account, something that I have not done before in any form I have shared. A direct address. To the person who is, perhaps, in the middle of what I have described. The person who feels watched and cannot find who is watching. If you are in the middle of this, or at the beginning of it, in the first days when the feeling is new and you are still working through the list of innocent explanations, still telling yourself it is imagination, still hoping that the next evening will be ordinary, I want to say a few things. First, the feeling is real. Not necessarily in the sense that something is there, I cannot make that determination for your situation. But the feeling is real as a fact about your experience. It is data. Treat it as data. Document it. Keep a log. Note the time, the direction, the quality. The log will help you, and if it becomes necessary to involve anyone else, the log will help them. Second, you are not going crazy. The experience of feeling watched when nothing is visible is genuinely disorienting, and the disorientation can compound on itself, feeling watched, then wondering if the feeling itself is a symptom of something wrong with you, then feeling more watched because now you are watching yourself watching for the watcher. This loop is real and it is exhausting, and it is not evidence of pathology. It is the predictable response of a consciousness trying to process an ambiguous and persistent threat signal. Third, tell someone. Not necessarily the police, though I advocate for that too, and for logging and documentation. But tell a person. The isolation of the experience, the sense that it is happening only to you, in a private register that others cannot access, is itself part of what makes it difficult. giving it language and sharing that language with someone who responds seriously and with care will not solve it but will change its quality. Fourth, you are not the first. There are others who have been through this. The experience I have described is not unique to me, or to this town, or to this time. People have been through exactly this, the watching, the notes, the cessation that has the quality of completion and have continued their lives. They have been changed by it. They have not been destroyed by it. Fifth, and this is the hardest one to say, and the one I feel most uncertain about, and the one I think is most important. Try not to reduce it before it is finished. What I mean is, the pressure to explain, to find the simple explanation, the innocent reason, the mundane cause is understandable and in many respects healthy. Most of the time the simple explanation is the right one. But there is a point at which the drive to explain becomes a form of not looking. A way of making the experience small so that it fits in a category that the tools you have can handle. Some experiences don't fit in those categories. That is not evidence that the tools are wrong, it is evidence that the map and the territory don't perfectly align, which is true of all maps. Be patient with the gap. Stay in the question for as long as the question needs. The asking, I was told, is the point. I believe this. Chapter 51. The house now. The house, now, is simply my house. I do not mean that in a small or dismissive sense. I mean it in the fullest sense, it is mine, known, claimed, inhabited. It has the quality that a place has when you have been through something in it and come out the other side with the place still standing and still yours. The cameras are still installed. I check them less often now, perhaps twice a week, a brief scan. Not from vigilance but from the same instinct that makes you check the locks before bed. A maintenance habit, not a fear habit. The curtains are still drawn early in the evenings. This one has stayed, and I don't mind it. The evenings are for being inside, and being inside doesn't require the street's visibility. I still sometimes stand at the upstairs window in the dark. Not every night, not even most nights. But occasionally. Looking at the tree and the pavement and the gate. Feeling the quiet. The feeling of being watched has not returned in its sustained form. There are moments, occasional, brief, unremarkable, when I notice a quality of attention in the air that I associate with the 3 weeks. I do not react to these moments with alarm. I notice them, and I hold them for a moment, and I continue with what I was doing. I think of them as reminders of the existence of the gap between what I know and what there is to know. Of the quality of the world when you are attending to it carefully. Of the connection, strange, asymmetrical, unexplained, between whatever was watching and whatever I am. The tree is still across the street. The gate is still at the end of the path. The house is still here, and I am still in it, and outside the windows the ordinary world continues in all its ordinary extraordinary detail. Chapter 52. Final note. I have been writing this account for 7 months. It began as a private document, the journalist's habit of making notes extended. It became something I shared with a small number of people, and their responses, the recognition, the similar accounts they offered, the questions they asked that I could not answer, suggested to me that it was worth making available more widely. I have tried, throughout, to be accurate. To resist the pull toward the more dramatic interpretation, the cleaner narrative, the more satisfying resolution. I have tried to give you the grain of it, the uncertain, and the ordinary alongside the inexplicable. What I am left with, at the end of 7 months of writing about 3 weeks, is this. Something was watching. The watching changed me. The watching was part of something larger that I do not fully understand. The something larger is, I believe, not malevolent. I believe, and this is belief, not knowledge, and I offer it as such, that the watching was a form of attention from something that attends to this world, to the beings in it, to the specific and improbable fact of consciousness here, in this universe, at this moment. I believe that some places, and some people, are more visible to that attention than others. Not because of anything they have done, but because of what they are. The quality of their awareness. The degree of their openness to the question. I believe that the asking is the point. Not as a consolation for not having answers. As the thing itself. The reaching toward. The sustained refusal to look away from what cannot yet be looked at directly. I am still here. The house is still here. The tree is across the street. The gate is closed. The curtains are drawn. And somewhere, in whatever register holds such things, someone or something is aware of that. The awareness is not frightening. The awareness, I think, is the whole point. End of extended record. Appendix. Supplementary interviews and testimonies. Interview 1. Lydia, 1 year later. I spoke with Lydia in the autumn, a full year after the 3 weeks had ended. We were sitting in the garden, the walled garden at the back of the house, with its padlocked gate, the one I had gone to check in the middle of the night so many times. It was a mild evening, and the last of the October light was fading over the back wall. She had agreed to speak more formally for this record, having been, until this point, a participant whose perspective I had rendered through my own. I asked her what the year had been like, living in the house, in the town, knowing what she knew. She was quiet for a moment. Different from what I expected, she said. I thought it would feel like waiting. Like living with the expectation of something returning. But it hasn't been like that. It's been more like living somewhere fully, for the first time. Like the experience ground something down. Some resistance I had to being entirely here. What kind of resistance? The kind you carry from somewhere else, she said. The Bristol experience, partly. The general disposition of someone who has been hurt by a place before and is protecting themselves from being hurt by a new place. She paused. I was living here with a kind of held-back quality. Not giving it everything. In case I needed to leave quickly. And the 3 weeks changed that. She considered. The 3 weeks showed me that I was already inside the thing I was trying to protect myself from. That there is no position outside the world from which you can manage your exposure to it. And once I understood that, the held-back quality seemed not just pointless, but a loss. I was losing time I could have been spending being here. She looked at the gate. I don't know what was watching, she said. I don't know if it was the same thing that watched me in Bristol, under a different form, or something else entirely, or something connected in ways I can't trace. I've stopped trying to know. But I know what it did, and what it did was push me the rest of the way into the life I was already in. She paused. That seems like a strange gift, she said. And also the only kind of gift something like that could give. Interview 2D, 18 months after his experience. I spoke with D on the phone, the line occasionally crackling with the kind of static that old exchanges produce. He was in good health and good spirits, his retirement evidently suiting him. I asked him whether, 18 months on, he had come to any conclusions about his experience. Conclusions are the wrong word, he said. I've come to a resting point. A place where I've settled the question of whether I need to keep pursuing it. And you've decided you don't. I've decided that what I experienced was real, that it was not random, that it was part of something I can't fully see, and that the part one can see, the part that was mine, is complete. He paused. My relationship to it is complete, I mean. The thing itself may continue. I'm just not part of it anymore, in the active sense. Does that feel like a loss? I asked. A long pause. It felt like a loss at first, he said. In the early months, when the watching had stopped but I was still adjusting to the silence it left. There was a deflation. A sense that the world had contracted back to its ordinary dimensions. Another pause. And then, gradually, I came to understand that the ordinary dimensions hadn't contracted. I had expanded to meet something during those weeks, and then that expansion had become part of me. The world hadn't shrunk. I had grown to include it. This was the most beautiful thing anyone said to me about any of this, and I wanted to record it exactly. I asked whether he had ever found out who or what had been watching his house. No, he said. And I've stopped looking. A pause. There's a thing that teachers sometimes say about learning. That the student is ready to learn when they stop asking about the grade and start asking about the subject. I think about that. The 3 weeks were the subject. I spent too much time asking about the grade, who, why, what did they want. The grade doesn't matter. The subject was real. Interview 3 R, 2 years after her experience. R was the scientist. The marine biologist. The one who had felt watched from multiple directions simultaneously, who had described the sensation of being at the center of a pattern. I asked her, 2 years on, how she thought about it in the context of her scientific work. I think about it in terms of systems, she said. In marine biology, particularly in the area I work in, you spend a lot of time thinking about systems that have components you can observe and components you cannot. The ocean is opaque beyond a certain depth. The behavior of ecosystems is constrained by processes happening at scales you can't directly measure. You learn to work with partial information. You learn to reason about the whole from the visible part. And the experience taught you something about that? It confirmed something I had suspected but hadn't fully inhabited, she said. That there are aspects of the system, the larger system, the one that contains all the smaller ones, that are not accessible from within the system. The way you can't see the ocean from inside it. You can move through it, respond to it, be shaped by it. But you can't see it. The universe from inside the universe. Something like that, she said. And the experience was a reminder, a very direct, very personal reminder that the fact that I can't see those aspects doesn't mean they're not there. Doesn't mean they're not affecting things. Doesn't mean they're not, in some sense, attending. She paused. I am not a person who uses the word attending easily, she said. It implies intentionality. I have no proof of intentionality. But I also have no proof of its absence. And in the absence of evidence either way, I find that I am more comfortable, more honest, with the position that says, I don't know. Something was happening. It was larger than me. It was attending to me, in whatever that means for something of that scale. And I am a small, local, temporary organization of matter and energy that had a brief but significant encounter with something much less constrained than I am. She was quiet for a moment. And that seems right, she said. That seems like an accurate description of the situation. Interview 4 Marcus. Marcus and I had dinner in December. He was in the middle of a new project, a documentary about something entirely different, a subject as far as possible from inexplicable surveillance. He was, as always, wary and precise and skeptical in all the most useful ways. I asked him, at the end of the evening, what he made of everything. The totality of it. Not the individual incidents, which we had discussed many times, but the whole. He thought for a while, in the way he does when he is actually thinking rather than performing thinking. I keep coming back to the edited footage, he said. That's the thing that doesn't have a mundane explanation. Everything else, a person standing outside your house, notes being left, the feeling of being watched, all of that is explainable by human behavior, strange human behavior, but human. The edited footage is different. Because it requires access to the system. Because it requires access to the system without any trace of access, he said. You don't just need the password. You need to be able to get in, make the change, get out, and leave no log. That's either a very sophisticated hacker or it's something else. What would the something else be? He looked at me. I spent 20 years covering crimes, he said. I've interviewed people who did terrible things, and I've interviewed people to whom terrible things were done, and I've been in the middle of situations where the difference between the two was not as clear as you'd want. And I've developed, over those 20 years, a very good sense of when something doesn't add up. When the explanation being offered doesn't quite cover what's being explained. He paused. The thing you experienced doesn't add up, he said. And I mean that in the most literal way. The pieces don't sum to a total I recognize. The human elements add up to a person doing strange and concerning things. The non-human elements, he stopped. The edited footage. The note through the letterbox with no one in the camera. The cessation that had the quality of completion. These don't add up to anything I have a category for. And what do you do with that? I asked. He shrugged. But it was not a dismissive shrug, it was the shrug of someone settling into an honest uncertainty. Same thing any journalist does when they have facts that don't add up, he said. You keep the file open. You stay attentive. You don't pretend you've resolved it when you haven't. He picked up his drink. And you continue doing the work. Whatever the work is. Closing note on the interviews. What strikes me, reading back through these conversations, is the consistency of what was offered, not the surface details, but the deeper register. Each person had arrived, by their own route and through their own specific experience, at a similar place. Not explanation. Not resolution. Not the satisfying click of a mystery that yields to investigation and delivers its solution. Something else. Something that might be described as a widened relationship to what is unknown. An expanded tolerance for the gap. a comfort or at least a peace with the fact that the experience was real and significant and not fully translatable into the languages currently available. D had grown to include it. R had found it consistent with the larger picture she was already working with. Lydia had been released into her own life by it. Marcus held the file open. And I have written about it for 7 months and ended here, with the file open, the questions still present, the house still standing, the tree still across the street. The asking is the point. Still asking. Final appendix. The notes transcribed in full. For the record, in the order they were received. Note 1, front path, morning, day 9. You don't need to worry. I am only watching. Note 2, car windscreen, day 14. I have been watching for longer than you know. You are safe. Note 3, letterbox, 3:47 a.m., day 20. I know you have been looking for me. I wanted you to know that I can see you looking. This is not a threat. This is an explanation. Some watchers are watched. You were being watched before me. I am watching the watchers. You are safe from what I am watching. You have always been safe from it. But it has not always been watching you. Note 4, posted 8 months after cessation. When you are ready to know more, you will know where to look. Library note, 6 months after cessation. You have asked good questions. The asking is the point. Keep asking. These notes are the only direct communication ever received from whoever was outside the house. They are the only words offered in the place of an explanation that was never given. I return to them often. I do not think I will stop returning to them. Not because they answer anything. Because they acknowledge that the questions are the right ones. And in a life full of questions that don't acknowledge themselves as right, full of the ordinary uncertainty that passes without comment, without confirmation, to have a question acknowledged is, in its way, its own kind of answer. Not enough. Never quite enough. But something. Something real. Something that was out there in the dark outside my house, watching, and knew I was inside watching back. And left a note to say, I see you. I see you seeing. Keep going.